The courtroom was a sea of bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, yet an oppressive hush blanketed the space, as though sound itself feared to intrude. The air hung heavy, thick with an invisible weight that clawed at the lungs of everyone present, making each breath a labor. This was meant to be routine, a mundane legal affair, another cog in the relentless machine of the justice system grinding through its daily churn. A case filed, a defendant summoned, an officer called to testify, nothing extraordinary, nothing to mark this day as different. But the moment the officer strode through those towering double doors, the atmosphere shifted, crackling with a tension that defied the ordinary. He moved with the swagger of a man who owned the ground beneath his polished boots. His uniform clung to him like a second skin, starched and pristine, every crease a testament to his meticulous control. The belt at his waist sagged under the weight of his tool handcuffs, a baton, a holstered gun, each item a silent boast of the power he carried. His face, weathered by years of unchallenged dominance, bore a smirk that curled with arrogance. This was no humble servant of the law. This was a man who had long since twisted his badge into a bludgeon, a weapon to wield against those he deemed unworthy of mercy. He scanned the room with a predator's gaze, his eyes glinting with disdain, as though the mere existence of the people before him offended his inflated sense of self. Then his stare settled on the black man standing at the center of it all. In that heartbeat, something shifted inside the officer, a darkening, a storm brewing beneath his skin. His jaw tightened until the muscles bulged. His fists clenched at his sides as though restraining some feral urge. It wasn't just anger that simmered there. It was a deep-seated entitlement, a conviction that certain lives were lesser, that his authority granted him the right to demand submission, without ever offering respect in return. The black man met his gaze, unflinching, his posture steady, his eyes burning with a quiet defiance that refused to bend. That single act of courage, looking back without apology, lit a fuse in the officer's fragile pride. "You better watch yourself, boy," he hissed, his voice a low growl dripping with venom. The words sliced through the stillness, sharp as a razor, deliberate in their cruelty. A chill swept through the room, prickling the skin of every onlooker. Gasps fluttered from the crowd like startled birds, but no one dared break the silence that followed. The black man didn't recoil, didn't shrink beneath the threat. He stood rooted, his face a mask of calm, his silence a wall the officer couldn't breach. That unyielding composure only fueled the officer's rage further. He wasn't accustomed to resistance, least of all from someone he'd already dismissed as insignificant. "You think you're somebody," the officer sneered, stepping closer, his breath hot and ragged, his presence looming like a storm cloud ready to burst. "You think you can stand there, look me in the eye like you matter?" The black man offered no reply, no flicker of emotion. His silence roared louder than any retort, a testament to a strength the officer couldn't comprehend. And that was the breaking point. Before anyone could react, before the bailiff could lunge forward, or the lawyers could shout a protest, the officer's fist rocketed through the air. The crack of knuckles meeting flesh reverberated through the courtroom, a sickening sound that turned stomachs and widened eyes. The blow sent the black man staggering backward, a spray of crimson blooming from his lip. The room erupted. A woman in the gallery let out a piercing scream, her hands flying to her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. A lawyer fumbled his pen, the clatter of it hitting the floor lost in the chaos as his jaw dropped in disbelief. Spectators leapt to their feet, some fumbling for their phones to capture the unthinkable, others frozen in a paralysis of shock. The air buzzed with a frenetic energy, a collective gasp at the brutality unfolding before them. But then, amid the pandemonium, something shifted again. The black man didn't crumple. He didn't collapse under the weight of the assault. Slowly, deliberately, he straightened, his shoulders squaring as he lifted his head. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth, a stark red line against his dark skin. But he didn't raise a hand to wipe it away. He simply stared at the officer, his eyes blazing with an intensity that cut deeper than any fist. He took a step forward, then another, his movements measured, unhurried. The clamor of the room faded into an eerie stillness, the crowd holding its breath as though sensing the tide turning. And then, with a voice as steady and unyielding as tempered steel, he spoke. "I am the judge of this court." The words detonated like thunder. reverberating off the walls and sinking into every soul present. Time seemed to halt. The officer's breath caught in his throat, his ruddy face draining to a ghostly white. His eyes darted wildly, searching the room for an escape, for someone to intervene, to assure him this was a nightmare he could wake from. But the truth bore down on him, relentless and unforgiving. He hadn't just struck a man, had assaulted a judge, a sitting arbiter of the law. In full view of a courtroom packed with witnesses, no one moved to shield him. No one offered a whisper of defense. The weight of his actions crashed over him, a tidal wave of consequence he couldn't outrun. His mouth opened, then snapped shut, his trembling hands betraying the bravado that had once defined him. The judge's gaze never wavered, pinning the officer in place with a quiet fury that needed no volume to command. "Officer," the judge said, his tone calm yet laced with a deadly edge. "You're under arrest for assaulting an officer of the court." The words were a guillotine, severing the illusion of the officer's invincibility. In an instant, the power he'd once lorded over others turned against him like a beast unleashed. The badge gleaming on his chest, the uniform he'd worn as armor, offered no shield now. A deputy, one of his own colleagues, stepped forward, his face grim, handcuffs dangling from his hand. "Turn around," the deputy ordered, his voice flat, devoid of sympathy. The officer's body locked up, his mind reeling in denial. This couldn't be real. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. But the cold bite of steel encircling his wrists snapped him back to reality. The click of the cuffs, a final, humiliating note in his downfall. The silence that enveloped the room this time was different, not born of fear, but of awe. It was the sound of justice asserting itself, unexpected and poetic. A moment too profound for anyone to disturb. Outside, the city of Memphis pulsed on, oblivious to the drama within the courthouse walls. The sun struggled to pierce the thick shroud of gray clouds, casting a muted light over the bustling streets. Horns blared, vendors hawked their wares, and a distant siren waylaid a familiar symphony of urban life. But inside, a different rhythm reigned, one dictated by the slow, deliberate dance of accountability. Judge Malcolm Bennett had spent decades in these hallowed halls, a man whose very presence reshaped the air around him. He didn't demand respect, he embodied it, earned through years of battling a system that often seemed designed to keep men like him out. Born in the gritty heart of South Memphis, Malcolm had grown up watching the scales of justice tip against those he loved. His father, a tireless laborer, had endured more harassment from police than protection, his dignity chipped away by countless unwarranted stops. His older brother, Dezen, had been ensnared by a false accusation, forced into a plea deal that stole years of his life for a crime he never committed. Those memories were etched into Malcolm's soul, scars that fueled his relentless climb to the bench. He'd vowed to be a shield for the voiceless, a hammer against the corrupt, and on this day, that vow met its crucible. The officer, meanwhile, stood shackled, his mind a whirlwind of panic and disbelief. He'd never imagined a reckoning like this. For years, he'd thrived on intimidation, his authority a cudgel to bend others to his will. He'd reveled in the fear he inspired, the way people averted their eyes when he passed. But now, those eyes, dozens of them, were into him, unflinching, judging, the deputy who cuffed him. A man he'd once shared crude jokes with over coffee, now looked at him as though he were a stranger. The betrayal stung, but it was nothing compared to the terror of what awaited him beyond this moment. The woman who'd screamed in the gallery clutched her purse, her knuckles white, her breath shallow. She'd come expecting a mundane hearing, not a front row seat to a man's unraveling. Beside her, an older man with graying hair shook his head, muttering under his breath about the shame of it all. The lawyer who'd dropped his pen still hadn't retrieved it, his hands trembling as he scribbled notes, trying to process the seismic shift he'd just witnessed. Each person in that room carried their own story, their own brush with a system that too often favored power over fairness. And now, they'd seen that system bite back. This wasn't just a tale of one man's folly, it was a lesson carved in blood and steel. Justice, when wielded by those who truly understand its weight, can topple even the mightiest tyrant. The officer's abuse of power had been his throne, but it was a fragile one, built on sand that crumbled beneath the judge's resolve. What followed his arrest would ripple far beyond that courtroom, a shockwave that left his family, his precinct, and the city grappling with the fallout. But in that moment, as the cuffs tightened and the silence held, one truth rang clear: no one stands above the law, and the consequences of forgetting that are as inevitable as they are profound. The courtroom was a stifling chamber of polished wood and muted light, its air heavy with the scent of old paper and the tension of countless untold stories. At its center stood a case that, to an outsider glancing at the docket, might have seemed routine. Another young black man, J.N. Carter, charged with resisting arrest. The file was thin, the accusations neatly typed, but Judge Malcolm Bennett knew better than to put his faith in the sterile lines of a police report. He'd spent years behind this bench, peering through the haze of manipulated words and half-truths, unearthing realities buried beneath layers of carefully crafted lies. Paper could deceive, men could deceive, and one such man now occupied the witness stand, his presence radiating a quiet menace that filled Malcolm with a slow-burning dread. Officer Ryan Calloway sat there, his broad shoulders squared, his face carved from stony and unyielding mask of arrogance that Malcolm recognized all too well. Calloway wasn't just a cop, he was a predator cloaked in blue, his badge not a symbol of service, but a weapon he wielded with impunity. His uniform clung to him like armor, a second skin that had long since convinced him he was beyond reproach. To him, people like J.N. Carter weren't individuals with lives, dreams, or fears. They were nuisances, obstacles to be crushed underfoot. Malcolm had seen the pattern before: profiling, harassment, brutality, and always the same outcome: a Calloway walking away unscathed, his record pristine, his smirk intact. This wasn't just power, it was power unchecked, festering into something dark and dangerous over years of indulgence. Calloway's demeanor in the courtroom only deepened Malcolm's unease. The officer lounged in the witness chair, hands resting casually in his lap, as if he were waiting for a bus rather than testifying in a court of law. His piercing blue eyes roamed the room, bored and dismissive, a faint sneer curling his lip whenever they brushed past Malcolm. It was a look that spoke volumes, a silent declaration that he didn't respect this court, this judge, or the system he was sworn to uphold. When he finally spoke, leaning back with his arms crossed and a smug grin tugging at his features, his voice carried the weight of unearned authority. "Your Honor," he drawled, the words dripping with condescension, "I did what needed to be done." Carter was aggressive. He refused to comply. "I had no choice but to use force." It was a rehearsed line, delivered with the confidence of a man who'd said it a dozen times before and never been challenged. Malcolm kept his expression a blank slate, but beneath the surface, a familiar anger simmered, a fire stoked by years of witnessing the same excuses, the same distortions of truth. He'd pored over the report earlier that morning, its language as predictable as it was hollow. Subject became combative. Force was necessary. Officer acted within protocol. Textbook. Beside him, J.N. sat rigid, his hands balled into tight fists, the bruises on his face a stark testament to Calloway's necessary force. Malcolm had studied the photos in the case file: J.N.'s swollen eye, the jagged cut slicing across his cheek, the unmistakable imprint of knuckles pressed into his skin. That was Calloway's handiwork. Yet there the officer sat, unfazed, spinning his tale as if it were gospel, as if no one would dare question the word of a man in uniform. But Malcolm wasn't just anyone. He adjusted his glasses, the lenses catching the dim light as he leaned forward, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. "Officer Calloway," he said, steady and deliberate, "your Bodycam footage seems to contradict parts of your statement. Can you explain that?" The room held its breath. For a fleeting moment, Calloway's smirk wavered, a crack in his facade so subtle it might have gone unnoticed. Then something shifted. The arrogance didn't vanish, it hardened, sharpening into something uglier: resentment. It wasn't just about this case or this question, it was deeper. A bitter current that ran through Calloway's career: belief that he shouldn't have to justify himself, especially not to someone like Malcolm Bennett, a black man in a judge's robe. The tension snapped like a taut wire. One moment Calloway was seated, the next he was on his feet, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh screech. His voice dropped to a guttural snarl, the words spilling out before anyone could brace for them. "You better watch yourself, boy." Time seemed to fracture. Malcolm saw the fist coming, a blur of motion, but there was no chance to react. The impact was savagely a sickening crack as knuckles met flesh, the force jolting Malcolm back in his chair. Pain flared across his jaw, his vision swimming for a heartbeat as the courtroom erupted into chaos. Gasps ricocheted off the walls. An attorney leapt up, his chair shrieking against the hardwood. A Aurora middle-aged woman with tightly curled hair clutched her chest, her eyes wide with horror. The court reporter's pen clattered to the floor, her hands trembling as she stared, frozen. The bailiff, a stocky man named Henry who'd worked this courtroom for a decade, stood rooted in place, his usual air of command replaced by stunned indecision. The air thickened, heavy with disbelief, as if the room itself couldn't fathom what had just transpired. A police officer had struck a black judge in open court. It wasn't just an assault, it was a violation of every principle the room stood for, a brazen defiance of justice itself. Calloway didn't flinch. He towered there, chest heaving, fists still clenched, his blue eyes blazing with a twisted satisfaction. He wasn't afraid, not of the consequences, not of the witnesses, not of the law he'd just shattered. In his mind, this wasn't a mistake. It was a triumph, a moment he'd perhaps dreamed of, a chance to put someone like Malcolm in his place. He stood waiting, daring someone to defend him, expecting the narrative to bend in his favor as it always had. Another misunderstanding, another justified reaction. But this time, the room didn't bend. Malcolm rose slowly, deliberately, ignoring the sharp sting in his jaw and the warm trickle of blood at the corner of his mouth. He didn't wipe it away. He didn't shout or curse. He let the silence stretch, thick and oppressive, forcing Calloway to feel the weight of his actions pressing down on him. The officer's bravado flickered, his breathing grew shallow, his fingers twitching nervously at his sides. Then Malcolm locked eyes with him, his gaze steady and unyielding, and a faint smile curved his lips. "I am the judge of this court," he said, his voice low but resonant, carrying the full force of his authority. The color drained from Calloway's face. For the first time, a shadow of doubt crept into his expression, his smug certainty crumbling under the realization of what he'd done. The courtroom seemed to shift, the invisible weight growing heavier, more suffocating. In the gallery, spectators stirred, their initial shock giving way to a swelling tide of outrage. Attorneys exchanged furtive glances, their minds racing to comprehend the magnitude of the moment. The jury, 12 ordinary souls thrust into an extraordinary scene, watched with rapt attention, their faces etched with awe and unease. Even Henry, the bailiff, finally moved, his hand hovering near his holster, though he seemed unsure whether to act or wait. This wasn't just a breach of decorum or a career-ending blunder. It was a reckoning. Calloway had crossed a line no one thought could be crossed, and in doing so, he'd exposed the rot beneath his badge of arrogance, the entitlement, the belief that power could shield him from consequence. But Malcolm's calm, unflinching response revealed something else. Justice wasn't a passive ideal. It was a force embodied in the man who now stood bloodied but unbroken, a living testament to its resilience. The lesson hung in the air, unspoken yet deafening. Power, when abused, invites its own downfall. Calloway had wielded his authority like a cudgel, blind to the fragility of his perch. Now, as the room bore witness to his unraveling, the truth crystallized. No uniform, no badge, no smirk could protect him from the consequences of his hubris. Justice, in the end, would not be silenced by fists, not by lies, not by men who thought themselves untouchable. And as Malcolm stood tall, his presence a quiet storm, the courtroom understood that this moment would echo far beyond its walls. A warning carved in blood and bone. The crimson smear clung stubbornly to his skin, a vivid slash of red against the otherwise flawless expanse of his hand. He made no move to wipe it away, no effort to erase the evidence of what had just transpired. Instead, he let it linger there, a bold and unapologetic testament to his rebellion, staining the pristine surface like a battle scar he wore with pride. It wasn't just blood, it was a declaration, a mark of defiance etched into his very being for all to witness. When he finally parted his lips to speak, His voice emerged not as a fragile whisper or a trembling plea, but as a force solid, resolute, unshaken by the gravity pressing down on the room. It carried the weight of unshakable authority, a sound that seemed to rise above the chaos and command the air itself. "Officer Calloway," Malcolm said, his tone cold, measured, absolute. The words sliced through the stillness, sharp and deliberate, sending a shiver rippling through the room. Every head turned, every neck stiffened, the fine hairs prickling as if brushed by an icy wind. There was no mistaking the power in his voice. No room for doubt or retreat. It was the sound of justice taking root. "You just assaulted a sitting judge inside his own courtroom," Malcolm continued, his words not posed as a question, but delivered as an unassailable truth. They hung there, heavy and suffocating, tightening around Calloway's throat like a noose woven from his own actions. For the first time since his fist had met flesh, a shadow flickered across Calloway's face, just a fleeting crack in the fortress of his composure. His eyes, usually so steely and unyielding, widened for a fraction of a second, betraying a spark of something rougher, perhaps, or the dawning realization of the abyss he'd stumbled into. But then, just as quickly, it vanished, swallowed by the darker currents swirling within him: pride, anger, a refusal to bend. He scoffed, a low, guttural sound that rumbled from his chest, dripping with disdain. "You're lucky that's all I did," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, yet loud enough to pierce the tense silence. And in that single, reckless breath, the atmosphere shifted irrevocably. The courtroom, once a bastion of order, seemed to pulse with a new energy, electric, volatile, alive with the weight of what had been unleashed. Calloway's words weren't just an admission, they were a gauntlet thrown down. A taunt laced with menace, a dare to the very system he'd long believed he could manipulate. In that moment, he understood too late what everyone else had already grasped. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. Malcolm stood motionless, his dark eyes locked on Calloway, unblinking, unflinching, a pillar of calm amid the storm. He didn't need to react to the officer's bravado. He didn't need to raise his voice or gesture wildly. He knew the machinery of justice had already begun to turn, its gears grinding into motion with a precision he'd set in place long before this day. "Take him into custody," he ordered, his voice as steady as the strike of a gavel, cutting through the murmurs that erupted like wildfire across the room. Gasps echoed off the high ceilings, whispers slithered between the rows of stunned onlookers, and the air grew thick with disbelief. Calloway froze, his smirk twitching at the corners, a muscle in his jaw jumping as the reality of Malcolm's command sank in. "You can't be serious," he said, but the confidence that had once armored his words was fraying, unraveling thread by thread. His broad shoulders stiffened, his chest heaved with a sharp, uneven breath, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed as though he might lunge forward, might let his instincts override reason and fight back against the inevitable. But the moment passed, and beneath the bravado, a quiet, gnawing truth took hold. He was powerless to stop this. Malcolm's gaze never wavered, his expression carved from stone as he watched the scene unfold. "You assaulted a judge in front of an entire courtroom full of witnesses," he said, each syllable a blade slicing through Calloway's defenses, stripping away the illusions he'd clung to for so long. "And you are under arrest." The words landed like a thunderclap, reverberating through the space, a seismic shift that left no room for argument or escape. Calloway's eyes darted wildly, scanning the faces around him: clerks, jurors, spectators searching for an ally, a savior, someone who might step forward and pull him back from the edge. But the room remained still, a sea of silent judgment staring back at him. For the first time in his career, the badge pinned to his chest, a gleaming shield he'd wielded like a weapon, meant nothing. The bailiff, a burly man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much, stepped forward, the handcuffs in his grip catching the harsh fluorescent light. "Turn around," he instructed, his voice firm yet tinged with a weary resignation, as if he'd long anticipated this day. Calloway's breath hitched, his hands flexing instinctively at his sides, but he complied. The cold steel snapped shut around his wrists, the sound sharp and final, echoing like a gunshot in the charged silence. As the bailiff led him away, Calloway's polished boots scuffed against the floor, his once imposing frame diminished with every step. The doors swung open, and beyond them, the world-weighted cameras flashing like a swarm of fireflies, their relentless bursts illuminating the disgrace now etched into his story. Stripped of his power, bound by the very laws he'd twisted to his advantage, Officer Ryan Calloway tasted the bitter sting of helplessness for the first time. And yet, even as the weight of his actions crashed down around him, threatening to drown him in their tide, a faint smirk lingered on his lips. It was a fragile, defiant thing, born of delusion or desperation, a belief that this was merely a setback, a chapter that would close as quickly as it had opened. He couldn't have been more wrong. This wasn't the end, it was the spark of something far greater, a reckoning that would ripple beyond the courthouse walls and shake the foundations of the world. He'd known. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of routine proceedings. It had transformed into something primal, a crucible where justice and consequence collided with a force that crackled in the air. The polished wooden benches, the faded American flag in the corner, the flickering lights overhead of it seemed charged, as if the very space had absorbed the tension and turned it into a living thing. Every breath felt heavier, every heartbeat louder, every unspoken thought a thread in the tapestry of this unprecedented moment. No one had foreseen this escalation, not the stenographer, her fingers trembling as they hovered over her keys, not the elderly clerk, peering over his glasses with a mix of shock and grim satisfaction, not even the young attorney in the back row, clutching his briefcase as if it could shield him from the chaos. A police officer, a man sworn to protect the law, had dared to raise his fist against a judge in the full glare of the judicial system, not in some dark alley or hidden corner where corruption often festered, but here, in the open, under the watchful eyes of dozens. It was an act so brazen, so unthinkable, that it shattered the illusion of invincibility Calloway had built around himself. For years, he'd worn his uniform like a second skin, a mantle of authority that shielded him from accountability. He'd walked the streets with a swagger, his chest puffed out, his voice booming with commands that brooked no dissent. He'd bent rules, skirted lines, and wielded his badge as a tool to silence those who dared question him. But now, as he stood in the center of the courtroom, hands bound, the fabric of his uniform felt thin and hollow, a costume rather than a symbol. The cracks in his facade were subtle but undeniable, the slight tremor in his fingers as they brushed against the cuffs, the way his jaw tightened until it ached, the shallow, rapid breaths he tried to disguise. Malcolm saw it all, his keen eyes missing nothing. He saw the arrogance warring with fear, the entitlement clashing with the creeping dread that this time there would be no escape. Stepping forward, Malcolm's shoes clicked against the hardwood floor. Each sound a deliberate punctuation in the thick silence. The room held its breath, every gaze fixed on him, every soul aware that this moment stretched beyond the here and now. He could feel the weight of history, the echoes of countless battles fought against men like Calloway, men who believed power was their birthright. This wasn't just about one officer's downfall. It was about the slow, relentless unraveling of a system that had protected the wrong people for too long. "You assaulted a sitting judge in open court," he said again, letting the words settle into the air, letting them burrow into Calloway's mind like roots breaking through stone. "There is no justification, no excuse, no badge to shield you now. The law you swore to uphold will decide your fate." His voice was a quiet storm, steady and unyielding, carrying the promise of consequences that could not be undone. Calloway exhaled slowly, a hiss of air through his nose, his face still a mask of defiance, but beneath it, something shifted. A flicker of uncertainty danced in his eyes, the first true sign that he was beginning to grasp the magnitude of his fall. Yet he clung to his bravado, his voice rising just enough to be heard. "You think this means something," he said, the words quieter now, laced with a forced edge. "You think one little moment like this changes anything?" He chuckled, a dry, hollow sound, shaking his head as if to convince himself that he still held the upper hand. "I've been in this system longer than you, Bennett. I know how it works. Men like me don't lose." The lie hung there, fragile and desperate, a lifeline he grasped even as it slipped through his fingers. Malcolm didn't flinch, didn't waver. He'd heard those words before, spoken in courtrooms, whispered in backrooms, woven into the very fabric of a society that had too often bent to men like Calloway. For years, he'd fought against that belief, dismantling it piece by piece, climbing through the ranks not for glory but for moments like this moments, when justice could finally bare its teeth. He stood there, a figure of quiet strength, his presence a reminder that power misused would always meet its reckoning. The lesson was clear, etched into the air between them. No one, not even a man cloaked in authority, could escape the consequences of their actions forever. And as Calloway was led away, the smirk fading from his lips, the courtroom held its breath not just for what had happened, but for what was still to come. In the tense stillness of the courtroom, Malcolm Bennett's voice sliced through the air, deliberate and steady, each syllable weighed with years of restraint. "You're right," he said at last, his tone a quiet thunder that rumbled beneath the surface of the chaos. The words hung there, heavy, sinking into the space between him and Ryan Calloway like a stone dropped into deep water. Malcolm paused, letting them ripple, letting Calloway feel their weight, letting him cling just for a fleeting heartbeat, the illusion that he still held the upper hand. The former officer's lips twitched upward, a ghost of that familiar smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth, the same one he'd flashed countless times before throughout interrogations, in courtrooms, on the streets, always walking away unscathed, untouchable. For that brief moment, he believed he'd won again. Then Malcolm leaned in, his broad shoulders casting a shadow over the polished wood of the bench, his voice dropping to a near whisper, sharp and intimate, meant only for Calloway's ears. Until they do, the words were a blade, honed and precise, slipping past the armor Calloway had worn his entire life. Before the man could fully register the shift, the courtroom doors exploded open with a force that shattered the fragile tension, like a sledgehammer crashing through a stained glass window. The sound echoed off the high ceilings, a violent crack that reverberated in the chests of everyone present. Reporters surged through the threshold like a tidal wave, their cameras flashing in relentless bursts, a storm of blinding light that painted the room in stark whites and harsh shadows. Microphones thrust forward like spears, voices clashing in a deafening roar of questions, accusations, demands all tumbling over one another in a chaotic symphony that drowned out any chance of silence. Calloway's body jolted, a marionette jerked by invisible strings. His chest heaved, his breath catching in his throat as his wide eyes darted toward the flood of journalists. The flashing lights reflected in his pupils, tiny pinpricks of panic flickering where arrogance once reigned. His hands, bound by the cold steel of handcuffs, twitched involuntarily, the metal biting into his wrists as the reality of the moment closed in around him. It was a trap, intricate and unyielding, one he hadn't seen coming yet in all his years of bending the law to his will, of wielding power like a club. That smirk, his shield through every trial, every accusation, every whispered deal in dimly lit precinct backrooms, it faltered, then vanished entirely, leaving his face bare, exposed, vulnerable for the first time in decades. Beyond the courtroom's heavy oak doors, the world was no longer content to merely watch. The steps of the courthouse had transformed into a battlefield, a sprawling expanse of concrete now overrun with a sea of Badice reporters shouting over one another, their voices sharp and insistent, cameras clicking like gunfire, protesters pressed closer, their chants rising in a swelling tide that crashed against the building's stone facade. "Justice now, justice now," they bellowed, fists punching the air, signs trembling in their grip, crudely painted words like "End the corruption" and "No more lies." Catching the late afternoon sun, the crowd was a living thing, pulsing with rage, vindication, and a raw, electric disbelief that crackled through the air. This wasn't just a moment anymore, it was a reckoning, one that would echo across news broadcasts for weeks, dissected by pundits, replayed in slow motion until every glance, every word, every breath was etched into the public's memory. Inside, though, the courtroom felt like a separate universe, cocooned from the storm raging just beyond its walls. The muffled roar of the crowd seeped through, distant and ghostly, as if the thick plaster and wood were straining to hold back the weight of what had unfolded. The air was thick, humid with tension, every breath a labor. The room had become a forge, a blistering crucible where the jagged edges of a fractured system were finally laid bare, glowing red-hot under the scrutiny of truth. And at its molten center stood Ryan Calloway, still upright, still handcuffed. His uniform stripped away but his posture rigid. Defiant, a man clinging to the wreckage of an empire he'd built on quicksand. His chest rose and fell in uneven gasps, the rhythm jagged, betraying the calm he tried to project. His shoulders remained squared, a soldier's stance, but his ice toes pale. Steely eyes that had stared down victims and judges Alec told a different story. The arrogance was gone, leached out of him like blood from a wound. In its place was something new, something fragile, uncertainty. It flickered there, faint but undeniable, as the cameras rolled, as the handcuffs tightened, as the shield of his badge, his lifelong talisman, crumbled to dust. For years, he'd walked through life untouchable, a predator in a world that bent to his will. Now, the prey stared back at him from the mirror of his own reflection. A few feet away, Malcolm Bennett stood like a pillar of granite, his dark eyes unreadable, his face a mask carved from resolve. He'd seen men like Calloway before too many times, in too many places, in the flickering fluorescent glow of police stations, where they bragged about their conquests over stale coffee, in courtrooms where they strode in with chins high, knowing the system was a machine oiled in their favor, on the streets, where their laughter mingled with the cries of those they'd broken. He'd watched them slip through the cracks again and again, their power a cocoon that shielded them from consequence. But not today. Today, the cocoon had split open, and the world was watching. Malcolm took a slow, deliberate step forward, the soles of his polished shoes tapping against the hardwood floor, a sound that cut through the stillness like a metronome, marking the end of an era. "Tell me something, Calloway," he said, his voice calm but resonant, each word a stone laid atop the other, building something immovable. "What does it feel like?" Calloway's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath the skin. His fingers curled, straining against the cuffs, the metal clinking softly as he shifted. "What does what feel like?" He snapped back, his tone low and coiled, a rattlesnake poised to strike. Malcolm didn't flinch. To know that, for the first time in your life, you have no control. The question landed like a blow, and for an instant something flickered in Calloway's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or the dawning of a truth he'd spent his life outrunning. The officers flanking him tensed, their hands hovering near their belts, waiting for the explosion they knew men like him were prone to. Calloway laughed then, but it was a hollow sound, brittle and jagged, cracking under its own weight. "You think this is justice?" He spat, his voice laced with a desperation he couldn't quite mask. "You think this little circus means anything? You think I don't know how this ends?" He shook his head, his wrists jerking against the restraints, his body a taut wire humming with fury he could no longer unleash. "I've seen this before. You people get your little win, your little taste of power, and you think you've changed something. But you and I both know how this works. The system doesn't break. It bends, sure, but it always snaps back." His words were a challenge, a last stand, but beneath them trembled the fear of a man who'd never had to face the abyss before. Malcolm studied him, his gaze piercing, peeling back the layers of bravado to the quivering core beneath. He let the silence stretch, let Calloway's defiance hang there, fraying at the edges. Then, finally, he spoke. "You're right," he said, and Calloway's head snapped up, eyes narrowing, searching for the trick. "The system doesn't change overnight. It doesn't bend just because it's right or fair. It takes time. It takes moments like this moment where people stand up and say enough." Calloway's smirk twitched, but Malcolm saw a subtle bob of his throat as he swallowed, the faint tightening of his jaw. "And today," Malcolm continued, stepping closer, his voice a steady drumbeat, unyielding and clear. "Today, you're not the one pulling the strings. Today, you're the one who answers for what you've done." The words struck like hammer blows, and Calloway's face hardened, his body trembling with a rage he could barely contain. "You think you're better than me?" he hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper, his eyes blazing with the hatred of a man unaccustomed to defeat. "You think that robe makes you more than me? You think they'll choose you over me? This country was built for men like me, Bennett. Men like me don't stay down." The air in the room shifted, a ripple of unease spreading through the gallery. Even now, handcuffed and cornered, Calloway believed the world would twist itself back into his favor, as it always had. Malcolm took another step, closing the distance until he could see the sweat beading on Calloway's brow, the faint tremor in his clenched fists. "You're right about one thing," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade through silk. "Men like you don't stay down back out. Men like you have never had to learn how to stand back up." Calloway's breath hitched, a sharp, involuntary sound. For a fleeting second, something broke through the mask fear, raw and unfiltered, a crack in the foundation he'd built his life upon. And today, Malcolm pressed on, his tone unwavering, absolute. "You learn." The words landed with a finality that shook the room, a verdict heavier than the cuffs around Calloway's wrists. For the first time, he wasn't the hunter. He was the hunted, and the lessened brutal, unescapable truth of justice was sinking in. The officers beside him shifted, their boots scuffing the floor, their eyes darting between the two men. The gallery leaned forward, breaths held, as the moment stretched beyond the courtroom's walls, spilling into the world outside. Justice wasn't just a word here, it was a force, a tide that swept away the illusions of power Calloway had clung to. And as the cameras flashed and the crowd roared, Malcolm knew this was more than a victory, it was a warning. Power, unchecked, devoured itself in the end, and today, Ryan Calloway was its latest meal. The air beyond the courthouse steps buzzed with the relentless flicker of camera flashes, a chaotic symphony of light and sound that pierced through the late afternoon haze. This wasn't merely about Ryan Calloway, though his name hung heavy in every whispered conversation and shouted headline. It was about every soul like Himtos who had strutted through life cloaked in arrogance, convinced their power placed them beyond reach, above consequence. Malcolm Bennett stood motionless, his silhouette sharp against the fading daylight streaming through the tall windows, watching as the scene unfolded with a weight that pressed against his chest. "Take him away," he said to the officers, his voice low but firm, cutting through the murmurs like a blade. Calloway's reaction was immediate, visceral, his lips parted as if to spit out some final defense, some venomous retort that might rewrite the story in his favor. His shoulders stiffened, muscles coiling beneath his tailored suit, and his iced toast cold. Calculating eyes blazed with a fury that spoke of a man unaccustomed to defeat. Words danced on the tip of his tongue, sharp and desperate, but they were useless now, swallowed by the reality crashing down around him. The officers stepped forward, their boots thudding against the polished floor, a rhythm that echoed like a drum roll in a theater of judgment. The cuffs snapped around his wrists with a metallic clink, tight and unyielding, and in that instant, the world tilted. Ryan Calloway, the man who had wielded the law like a personal scepter, twisting it to shield his sins and crush his enemies, was finally dragged into its unrelenting grip. He thrashed against the restraints, his movements wild, almost feral, until the very last second when the heavy doors slammed shut behind him. The sound reverberated deep, hollow boom that lingered in the air, marking the end of his reign. And then silence. Justice had arrived, raw and imperfect, but undeniable. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere transformed. The suffocating tension that had once clung to every corner, thick with doubt and fear, gave way to something new, something heavier yet strangely liberating. It was as if the very walls had borne witness to the unraveling of a titan and absorbed the gravity of it all. The echo of those doors still hummed through the space, a sound no one would soon forget, a sound that carried the fall of a man who had spent decades untouchable, ruling from a throne built on manipulation and privilege. The spectators remained rooted to their seats, their faces a gallery of conflicting emotion, shock etched into wide eyes, a flicker of grim satisfaction curling lips, and a quiet unease tightening jaws. They had seen justice served, had watched Calloway's empire crumble under the weight of his own hubris. But beneath the triumph lingered a shadow of doubt. Was this truly the end? Could a system so long warped by men like him hold firm now? Malcolm stood at the center of it all, his posture unyielding, his expression a mask of stone. His hands rested at his sides, fingers twitching slightly as the sting of Calloway's earlier punch pulsed faintly. Along his jaw a dull, nagging ache he refused to acknowledge. He wouldn't give the man that satisfaction, wouldn't flinch or falter. Instead, he let the moment settle over him like a mantle, its weight sinking deep into his bones. This was what he'd fought for his entire life, moments where the scales tipped, if only briefly. toward righteousness. Moments where the law, so often a tool of the powerful, became a blade that cut both ways. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, dozens of gazes boring into his back. But he didn't turn. He let them watch, let them wrestle with their own tangled feelings about what they'd just seen. Outside, the clamor grew louder. Reporters jostled for position, their voices a rising tide of questions and demands, while the crowd swelled, their chants weaving a tapestry of hope and cynicism. Some cried out in vindication, fists raised as if this single arrest could rewrite history. Others muttered skeptically, their tones laced with the exhaustion of a city that had seen too many hollow victories. Malcolm knew the truth they all danced around. This wasn't the end. Calloway's removal in chains was a blow, yes, but men like him were survivors, slippery as eels, always finding cracks to slither through. He swept his gaze across the room over the jury, their faces pale and uncertain, over the attorneys, some scribbling notes, others staring blankly, over the ordinary people who had stumbled into this seismic event and would carry it with them forever. Some met his eyes with awe, a flicker of hero worship in their stares. Others shrank back, fear glinting in their expressions, but most simply looked lost, grappling with the messy reality of just to see a force that never arrived neatly packaged, never tied up with a bow. His chest rose with a slow, deliberate breath, steadying the storm of emotions swirling within him. He'd been here before, not in this exact crucible, but in quieter battles, the kind that didn't draw crowds or cameras, cases that unfolded in dimly lit rooms, victories that tasted bitter, defeats that somehow carried a strange hope. He'd seen justice handed down, only to watch it unravel on appeal, seen the powerful slip free while the powerless bore the cost. That was the unspoken aftermath. No one wanted to face what came next. Calloway would be processed now, his mugshot snapped, his fingerprints pressed into ink, his name logged into the very system he'd once bent to his will. But then what? Would bail set him loose? Would his allies in the department shield him? Would his lawyers unearth some obscure loophole? Or the media twist his downfall into a tale of martyrdom? Malcolm exhaled, his fingers flexing as if to shake off the creeping dread. He'd watched too many moments, like this fray at the edges, the promise of consequence dissolving into nothing. A flicker of movement in the gallery pulled his attention. He turned his head just enough to catch sight of Jalen Carter, the young man whose fate had sparked this entire reckoning. Jalen sat hunched forward, his hands locked together so tightly his knuckles blanched, his face a storm of confusion and disbelief. He was still a boy, really, barely 20, with eyes that had seen too much and a life that had nearly been swallowed by this circus. It had started with Hyman arrest on a flimsy charge of resisting, the kind of case Malcolm had seen 100 times, a spark that should have flickered out. But Calloway, in his arrogance, had fanned it into a wildfire, overreaching until his own power became his undoing. Now Jalen sat there, watching the man who'd nearly destroyed him be hauled away in cuffs. Yet the doubt in his eyes was unmistakable. Malcolm could read it as clearly as if the boy had spoken it aloud. This didn't feel like victory. Not entirely. He crossed the room, his steps soft against the gleaming floor, the sound swallowed by the lingering hush. When he reached Jalen, he crouched slightly, bringing himself to the boy's level. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quieter now, a thread of warmth woven into the steel. Jalen hesitated, his breath shuddering out in a slow, uneven sigh. He shook his head, just a fraction, his voice a fragile whisper. "I don't know." Malcolm nodded, the weight of that honesty settling between them. He understood God, how he understood. "This isn't over," he said, his tone steady but unflinching. "But today, he lost." Jalen swallowed hard, his fingers tightening until his hands trembled. "Yeah," he murmured, but the word carried a hollow edge, a flicker of disbelief for now. It hung unspoken. Malcolm didn't push, didn't offer false promises. He wouldn't dishonor the boy's sharp mind with platitudes about a system that had failed him. And so many like him do often. Outside, the chants swelled, a chorus of a city teetering on the edge of hope and despair. Malcolm straightened, his gaze drifting toward the doors. The moment stretched onward, rippling out into the world like a stone dropped into still water. This wasn't just a case, not just a verdict, it was a crack in the facade of invincibility. A reminder that even the mightiest could fall. And maybe, just maybe, it was the start of something greater. The courtroom remained charged, the air thick with unspoken questions. The weight of consequences still settling. Justice had spoken, but its voice was rough, its edges jagged. It was a lesson carved in stone. Power, when abused, invited its own ruin. And as the echoes of Calloway's defeat faded, Malcolm stood tall, knowing the fight was far from over but savoring, for one fleeting moment, the taste of a world forced to reckon with itself. The air inside the courthouse hung heavy, thick with the residue of tension that seemed to seep into every corner, every crevice of the old wooden benches and the scuffed marble floors. It wasn't a lightness that followed the clang of handcuffs snapping shut around Calloway's wrists, nor was it the sweet release of freedom. Instead, it was something electric, a pulsing undercurrent that vibrated through the room, an unspoken question, buzzing in the minds of everyone present, from the weary court officers leaning against the walls to the attorneys shuffling their papers. With mechanical precision, would this moment, this rare crack in the impenetrable armor of a system built to shield men like Calloway, actually mean anything, or would it dissolve into the ether, rewritten and reshaped by the same machinery that had let so many others slip through its grasp? Unscathed, Jalen Carter sat motionless at the defendant's table, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles strained against his skin, turning pale under the pressure. His face was a mask, stoic, unreadable, but his eyes betrayed him. They flickered with a storm of thoughts, dark and restless, darting from the empty judge's bench to the spot where Calloway had been led away moments before. He wasn't thinking about victory. He wasn't basking in the relief of a dismissed case, or the weight of charges lifted from his shoulders. No, Jalen was wrestling with something deeper, something that gnawed at him like a splinter buried too far beneath the skin to pull out. He'd been here before, in this exact room, perhaps, but in this exact moment, pressing himself for the system to chew him up and spit him out, just as it had done to countless others who looked like him, who carried the same invisible scars of a world that never seemed to bend in their favor, and yet, today had defied that script. Calloway, a man who wielded power like a blunt instrument, had been hauled off in cuffs, his tailored suit rumpled, his smug certainty shattered. The judge, Malcolm Bennett, a figure many had expected to buckle under the weight of influence, had stood firm, his gavel striking with a resonance that still echoed faintly in Jalen's ears. But even now, with the impossible made real, Jalen's shoulders remained hunched, his breath shallow. He couldn't shake the dread that this was temporary, a fleeting mirage of justice destined to evaporate. Malcolm Bennett watched him from across the room, his own chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. He could feel the ache in his ribs, not from exertion, but from the burden of knowing what Jalen was feeling. He'd been there too, years ago, sitting in a chair much like the one Jalen occupied now, staring at a courtroom that felt more like a cage. Back then, he'd expected the system to grind him down, to render him another casualty in a long line of forgotten names. Instead, he'd clawed his way out, rising to the bench, determined to wield the gavel as a tool rather than a prop. Today, he'd done just that. He'd watched Calloway's face twist in disbelief as the ruling came down, watched the officers lead him away while the man's furious protests bounced off the walls. But Malcolm wasn't naive. He knew the victory was fragile, teetering on the edge of a precipice. He could already sense the gears turning. Calloway's allies in their high towers, their hushed phone calls and carefully worded emails plotting to undo what had been done. Still, he couldn't let Jalen drown in that same cynicism. Not yet. He crossed the room with measured steps, the soles of his shoes clicking softly against the floor, a sound that cut through the low hum of murmurs from the lingering crowd. "You did good today," he said, his voice low but steady, each syllable carrying the weight of intention. He stopped a few feet from Jalen, close enough to see the faint tremor in the younger man's hands. Jalen didn't look up right away. His breath slipped out in a slow, uneven hiss, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than Malcolm expected, rough around the edges with something raw and unguarded. "Did I?" The question wasn't a challenge, it was a fracture, a glimpse into the turmoil churning beneath his composed exterior. He lifted his gaze then, meeting Malcolm's eyes, and there was no relief there. No flicker of triumph, only doubt, sharp and unrelenting. Malcolm held that gaze, letting the silence stretch between them, letting Jalen's words settle into the air like dust after a storm. He understood that doubt. He'd carried it himself, felt it claw at him in the dead of night when the world was quiet and the truth was loud. "He's going to walk," Jalen said suddenly, his jaw tightening as he forced the words out. "Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow. But we both know he's not going to rot in a cell the way I would have." His fingers twitched, curling tighter, and his voice dropped lower, laced with a bitterness that seemed to age him in an instant. "They'll make sure of it." The truth in those words hit Malcolm like a punch to the gut. He couldn't deny it, not the reality that Calloway's wealth and connections were already weaving a safety net beneath him, not the fact that the system was a labyrinth designed to favor the powerful. He'd seen it play out too many times, the narrative shifting, the aggressor recast as the aggrieved, the slow erosion of accountability until the scales tipped back in their favor. He took a step closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper, something meant only for Jalen. "Maybe," he said, his tone even but resolute, "maybe they'll try. Maybe they'll pull every string they've got. Maybe the system will do what it's always done and bend over backwards to protect him." He paused, letting the weight of that possibility hang there, heavy and real. But today, for the first time in his miserable life, Calloway wasn't the one calling the shots. Today, he wasn't the one with the power. Jalen swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as his fingers twitched again. Restless against the table, his eyes shifted, darting to the side as if searching for something to anchor him. Malcolm pressed on, his voice growing quieter still, more insistent. "And that matters, Jalen. Whether they bury it, twist it, or try to erase it that happened, they can't unmake it." He felt what it's like to be on the other side, even if just for a moment. A faint exhale escaped Jalen's nose, and he gave a small, reluctant nod. But the uncertainty lingered in the lines of his face, etched into the furrow of his brow. Malcolm could see it war inside him, the clash between hope and the hard-earned skepticism that had kept him alive this long. Before he could say more, a shadow fell across the table. The prosecutor, a weary man named Ellis with a perpetually tense jaw, approached. His steps brisk but cautious, his face was a blank slate, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "Judge Bennett," he began, his voice careful, measured, like he was testing the waters. "There's already talk of appeals. Calloway's lawyers are gearing up pushing for bail, claiming it was an emotional outburst. A heat-of-the-moment thing. You know what that means." Malcolm nodded, his expression unchanging. He knew exactly what it meant. They'd spin it, paint Calloway as a man overwhelmed, a victim of circumstance rather than a perpetrator. The press would latch on, some outlets already framing him as a flawed but decent soul who'd stumbled, while others would turn their lenses on Malcolm, questioning his authority, his impartiality, his very presence on the bench. "Some people are already buying it," Ellis added, his lips pressing into a thin, frustrated line. Malcolm drew a slow breath, the reality sinking into his bones like cold water seeping through cracks. He'd watched this game unfold too many times, the powerful slipping through the net, their misdeeds reframed as misunderstandings, their victims left to shoulder the blame. He glanced at Jalen, who was watching the exchange with a quiet intensity, his earlier bitterness now simmering into something closer to resignation. "They're going to flip it on you," Jalen said, his voice barely above a whisper, heavy with the weight of inevitability. "Make you the villain for standing up." Malcolm let the words settle, let them sink deep into the marrow of the moment. He felt the truth of them, the familiar sting of a system that punished those who dared to challenge it. But he straightened, his shoulders squaring as he met Jalen's gaze again. "Let them try," he said, his voice carrying a quiet steel that left no room for doubt. "Let them spin their lies, let them fight tooth and nail to shield him. Because no matter what they do, no matter how hard they push, they can't erase what happened here. They can't take away the fact that, for once, a man like Calloway had to face the consequences of his own power." Jalen studied him for a long moment, his dark eyes searching Malcolm's face for something reassurance, conviction, maybe just a shred of proof that this wasn't all for nothing. Finally, he nodded. A small, almost imperceptible gesture, but it was enough. Outside, the crowd roared louder, a restless tide of voices crashing against the courthouse steps. Reporters jostled for position, their camera flashes slicing through the late afternoon haze, their microphones thrust forward like spears, desperate to capture the raw pulse of history unfolding. Malcolm knew the fight wasn't over. It never was. The appeals would come, the headlines would shift, and Calloway's machine would churn on. But today, a step had been taken. A crack had formed in the unyielding wall of privilege, and sometimes, in a world that thrived on bending justice to fit the powerful, a single step was enough to keep the fire burning. The air inside the courthouse shifted subtly, as people began to filter out, court officers loosening their ties, attorneys gathering their briefcases with weary sighs, spectators whispering in huddled clusters. It wasn't freedom that lingered in the room, nor was it defeat. It was something in between, a charged suspension of time where the weight of what had happened pressed against every surface. Malcolm lingered near the bench, his hands gripping the edge of the polished wood, his fingers tracing the faint grooves worn by years of trials and rulings. His breath was steady now, his heartbeat a slow, even drum. But the pressure in his chest remained a reminder that winning a battle didn't end the war. Across the room, Jalen rose slowly from his seat, his movements stiff, deliberate, like a man testing the ground beneath him after a long fall. He paused, his hands hovering over the table, then looked back at Malcolm. "You're free to go," Malcolm said, his voice cutting through the muted chaos of the room. Jalen flinched, a subtle twitch of his shoulders, as if the words were foreign, incomprehensible. He shook his head slightly, a dry, humorless laugh escaping his lips. "Just like that," he muttered, his tone thick with disbelief, with the exhaustion of someone who'd spent too long waiting for the catch. Malcolm nodded, stepping closer. "Just like that." Jalen's laugh faded, replaced by a quiet, bitter murmur. "It's never just like that." His voice was so soft it nearly dissolved into the air. But Malcolm caught it, and he felt the ache of its truth. Because Jalen was right, it wasn't simple. Freedom didn't erase the nights he'd spent staring at a cell ceiling, the fear that had coiled in his gut, the humiliation of being reduced to a case number. It didn't erase the what-ifs that still haunted him. What if Calloway's influence had tipped the scales? What if Malcolm hadn't been the one holding the gavel? What if the system had done what it so often did and swallowed him whole? Malcolm closed the distance between them, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "You're right," he admitted, his eyes locking with Jalen's. "It's not just like that. It never is. But today, you walk out of here with your name intact. That's not nothing, Jalen. That's something they can't take away." Jalen's gaze flickered, shifting to the side, his jaw clenching as he exhaled a slow, shaky breath. "Yeah," he said, the word flat, unconvincing. But Malcolm could see the gears turning behind his eyes, the slow unraveling of a man trying to reconcile what he'd been given with what he'd lost along the way. "What are you thinking?" Malcolm asked, his tone gentle but probing. Jalen let out a long, measured breath, his fingers flexing against the table one last time before he straightened fully. "I'm thinking it's not over," he said, his voice steady now, resolute. "Not for him, not for me, not for any of us." Malcolm nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the truth they both carried. Outside, the crowd's chants grew louder, a rhythmic swell of anger and hope intertwined, spilling over the steps and into the streets. The cameras kept flashing, the reporters kept shouting, and somewhere, in the shadows of power, Calloway's allies were already plotting their next move. But here, in this moment, Malcolm and Jalen stood as witnesses to something undeniably lesson carved into the fabric of the day. Justice, however fleeting, could sting even the untouchable, and the misuse of power could, for once, bear a cost. It wasn't the end. It was barely a beginning. But it was enough to remind them both that the fight was worth it. Jalen Carter sat at the worn wooden table, his head bowed slightly, shaking it as though trying to dislodge the tangle of thoughts knotted inside his mind. "I don't know," he murmured, his voice a quiet thread woven with resolve, yet heavy with the weight of uncertainty. He paused, his breath catching as he searched for the right words to capture the storm brewing within him. It feels like I'm just sitting here, waiting for a door to slam shut behind me. Like any moment now, someone's going to burst back into this room, their face grim, their voice sharp, and tell me it's all been a mistake. They'll say they're taking it back, every bit of freedom I thought I'd gained, and that I still owe a debt for something I never even did. His fingers, trembling with a fury he couldn't release, curled into a tight fist against the table's scratched surface. His body was a live wire, coiled with tension that pulsed through every muscle, a restless energy trapped with nowhere to go, no outlet to ease the pressure building inside him. Across from him, Malcolm Bennett watched in silence, his presence steady and unshaken. He didn't rush to fill the quiet with empty platitudes or hollow reassurances. He understood too well the depth of Jalen's turmoil, the raw ache of a truth that had been forged over years of watching justice bend and twist, a fickle thing that only seemed to work when the right hands pulled its strings. Malcolm's dark eyes traced the lines of exhaustion etched into Jalen's face, the faint tremor in his hands, the way his shoulders hunched as though braced for a blow that might still come. He knew words couldn't erase the scars Jalen carried, couldn't unmake the reality that had shaped him. But Malcolm wasn't a man to let this moment slip away, to let it become just another mark on a soul already burdened by too many. He leaned forward slightly, his voice cutting through the stillness with a calm, unwavering strength. "Then don't wait for that door to close," he said, each word deliberate, landing like a stone dropped into still water. "Get up and walk through it before they even get the chance to try." Jalen's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto Malcolm's with a jolt of surprise. For a heartbeat, his breath hitched, caught in his throat as he searched Malcolm's face, searching for a lie, a trick, a crack in the certainty he saw there. In that fleeting moment, something shifted between them, a hesitation, a choice dangling in the air like a thread pulled taut, a crossroads where paths diverged and futures hung in the balance. Jalen's chest rose and fell unevenly, his mind racing as he wrestled with the weight of what Malcolm was offering, not just words, but a lifeline, a dare to believe in something he'd long stopped trusting. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, he nodded. It was a small gesture, but it carried the force of a decision made, a step taken into the unknown. Malcolm watched as Jalen rose to his feet, his movements deliberate yet laced with uncertainty, like a man stepping onto a frozen lake, unsure if the ice would hold. His hands hovered near the table's edge, as though tempted to grip it for support, to anchor himself against the fear that any second someone might lunge forward, grab his arm, and force him back into that chair. But no one did. The court officer approached, his boots echoing softly against the polished floor, his expression neutral as he gestured toward the exit. There was no barked order to sit, no sudden reversal to snatch away the moment. For the first time in weeks that had stretched into an eternity of cold steel cuffs and sleepless nights, Jalen Carter walked out of that courtroom unshackled, his wrists bare, his steps tentative but free. The air shifted as he passed through the doorway, a quiet ripple of something new, something fragile yet undeniable. But Malcolm knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was barely the beginning. Beyond those heavy oak doors, the world waited, restless and hungry. Outside, the courthouse steps swarmed with life, reporters jostling for position, their microphones thrust forward like spears, cameras flashing in sharp, blinding bursts, protesters chanting with voices raw from passion, their signs bobbing above the crowd, and counter-protesters murmuring their dissent, their anger simmering just beneath the surface. It was a chaotic symphony of belief and outrage, a city split down the middle, some hailing this day as a triumph, a rare crack of light in a broken system, others decrying it as a travesty, a betrayal of the powerful. There were those who wanted to see Calloway, the man at the center of it all, burned for what he'd done, and others who would claw through the ashes to hoist him back onto his pedestal, to restore the order they'd always known. Malcolm turned back toward the judge's bench, his shoulders slumping slightly as he exhaled a long, slow breath. The tension that had gripped him throughout the trial seeped into his bones, settling there like a familiar ache. He'd spent his career navigating moments like this, choosing his battles with the precision of a surgeon, knowing when to press forward, when to hold back, when to let his voice ring out, and when to let silence speak for him. But now, for the first time in years, he felt the ground beneath him shift, uncertain of what lay ahead. The bailiff, a stocky man with a graying mustache and a perpetually furrowed brow, cleared his throat as he stepped closer. "Judge Bennett," he said, his tone clipped but respectful. "Security's asking if you want an escort out of the building." Malcolm glanced at him, one eyebrow arching faintly in curiosity. "Are they expecting trouble?" he asked, his voice low, probing. The bailiff hesitated, his jaw tightening as he chose his words. "They're expecting a reaction," he replied, his eyes flickering with something unspoken concern. "Perhaps, or a quiet warning." Malcolm let the words hang between them, tasting their weight, before giving a slow nod. "Tell them I'll walk out the front door," he said, his tone firm, final. The bailiff's face remained impassive, but Malcolm caught the brief widening of his eyes. A flash of surprise quickly masked as the man nodded and turned away. Malcolm knew what awaited him outside those doors he'd seen it building all day. Felt it in the air like the charge before a storm. Walking out meant stepping straight into the blaze, facing the roar of a world that wouldn't let this moment fade quietly. And he was ready, no matter how the narrative twisted, no matter how they tried to shrink it into something small, something dismissible. They couldn't erase the truth. And that truth, raw and unyielding, was enough to carry him forward. The air outside the courthouse hit him like a wall thick with noise, movement, and the sheer gravity of what had unfolded. It was a tempest of sound, voices clashing, rising and falling in waves, reporters shouting questions over one another, their words tangling into a frantic chorus, the sharp click and flare of camera shutters cutting through the din, protesters' chants rolling like thunder, met by the low, defiant rumble of those who opposed them. The courthouse loomed behind him, its stone facade weathered and stern, a place where justice had so often been warped, manipulated, or outright denied. Today, though, it stood as the stage for something no one had foreseen, something that swelled beyond its walls and spilled into the streets, growing larger with every passing second. Malcolm Bennett paused at the top of the wide steps, his shoulders squared against the chaos below, his hands steady at his sides. His face was a mask of calm, unreadable to the crowd, but his presence carried a quiet power that silenced no one yet commanded attention all the same. He wasn't a man who chased the spotlight, never had been. He didn't hunger for the kind of influence that came with fame, or the intoxicating rush of being seen. But today, he knew this moment would mark more than just a single case. It would carve a line through his life, through callaways, through the story that would echo long after the cameras turned away. The reporters surged forward, a tide of eager faces and outstretched arms, their microphones glinting in the afternoon sun like drawn blades. Their questions came fast, sharp, relentless. "Judge Bennett, do you think Calloway will actually see prison time? Are the charges solid? Or is this just a gesture? What do you say to those who call this political persecution? Are you worried about your safety after today?" That last one lingered, heavy with implication. They weren't just asking about threats, they were asking if he feared the system itself, the silent machinery of power that protected men like Calloway, the unspoken alliances that might turn on him for daring to stand firm. Malcolm let the noise swell around him, let the tension coil and tighten, let the moment stretch until it felt alive. Then when he spoke, his voice was a low, steady current cutting through the storm. "The world saw what happened today," he began, each word measured, deliberate, weighted with the memory of every injustice he'd witnessed at every case that had slipped through the cracks, every man like Calloway who'd walked free when the gavel should have fallen harder. The world saw what accountability looks like when the system doesn't shield those who twist it for their own ends. But the real question isn't whether Calloway will face justice today. It's whether this own fleeting moment will hold meaning tomorrow, next week, next year. Because justice isn't about one man in chains. It's about what we do with what comes next. His words settled over the crowd like a sudden hush, a pause that seemed to stretch into forever before the voices erupted again, louder, more insistent. "What do you mean, Judge Bennett? Are you saying this could unravel? Do you think Calloway will slip through again?" Malcolm didn't respond. He'd said what mattered, laid bare the truth as he saw it. He'd watched this story play out before different names, different courtrooms, The same dance of power and consequence. A man like Calloway could be brought low, but the system that birthed him, cradled him, emboldened him. It had a way of lifting its favorites back up, dusting them off, letting them stride back into the light. Still, one thing was certain. Calloway would never be the same, not after this. Calloway had swaggered into that courtroom weeks ago, his chin high, his smirk sharp, convinced he was untouchable. He'd thrown a punch at a Judge Malcolm himself in full view of a packed room, witnesses gasping, pens scratching furiously across notepads. And still, he'd believed he'd walk away unscathed, that the rules didn't apply to him, that his name, his wealth, his connections would bend reality to his will. That belief had crumbled not just under the verdict, not just beneath the cold snap of handcuffs around his wrists, but in the stark, undeniable truth that, for once, he hadn't held the reins. Malcolm knew men like Calloway, knew the fault lines that ran through them. It wasn't the threat of a cell that haunted them, not the trial or the flash of cameras or the ink spilled across headlines. It was the stripping away of power, the sudden, brutal realization that they could be made small. That was the wound Calloway would carry, a scar no lawyer, no ally, no spin could erase. Malcolm drew a slow breath, then stepped down from the makeshift podium of the courthouse steps, moving through the sea of reporters and onlookers. The crowd parted for him, their eyes following not just as a judge, not just as a figure in a robe, but as a man who'd stared down something vast and refused to flinch. In the distance, near the edge of the throng, he spotted Jalen Carter. The younger man stood apart, his posture rigid, his hands buried deep in his pockets, his gaze darting between the chaos of the press and the quiet reality of his own freedom. He looked like a man caught in a dream he couldn't trust, waiting for the moment it would dissolve into nightmare. Malcolm approached, stopping a few feet away, his presence a steady anchor in the storm. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Jalen let out a ragged breath, shaking his head slightly as though the question itself was too big to answer. "I don't know," he said, his voice rough, scraped raw by emotion. His body tensed, shoulders drawing tight. "It feels like this should mean more, like it should feel bigger than it does." Malcolm studied him, taking in the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the way his hands twitched as though itching to hold onto something solid. "It does," Malcolm replied, his tone even, grounded. "Even if you can't feel it yet." Jalen exhaled sharply, his gaze sliding away, lost in the swirl of the crowd, the weight of a moment that was both victory and question mark. For him, justice wasn't just a word, it was a lesson carved into his skin, a reminder that power could corrupt, but its fall could reshape everything. And for Malcolm, watching him, it was a call to keep fighting, to ensure this wasn't just a spark that faded, but a fire that endured. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, the faint creak of the wood echoing in the quiet room as he locked eyes with his friend. A slow, thoughtful nod passed between them, an unspoken agreement hanging in the air like the last note of a song. "Yeah," Malcolm said, his voice low and steady. "Guess we'll see." His words weren't rushed, but deliberate, as if he were turning over a heavy stone in his mind, unsure of what might crawl out from beneath it. Justice, he thought, wasn't some fleeting snapshot framed in time. It wasn't the clink of handcuffs snapping shut, or the triumphant gavel banging down in a courtroom. No, it was something messier, something that stretched out like a shadow after the sun dips below the horizon. It was about what lingered when the dust settled, when the crowds dispersed, and the world moved on. He wondered aloud, his brow furrowing slightly, what do you reckon justice really is? Is it seeing a guy like Calloway, some big shot who thought he was untouchable Finley, dragged off in chains? Or is it bigger than that? Something that doesn't just happen in one blazing moment, but in how that moment echoes through time, in how people carry it with them long after the lights go out. He paused, letting the question settle like smoke curling upward, thick and unyielding. Does it even hold up when no one's around to cheer for it? When the system's gears start grinding again in the dark? Tell me what you think. Drop it below. Keep this going, because this isn't the end of it. His voice carried a quiet intensity, a spark that begged for more than just an answer. It demanded reflection, a wrestle with the truth. And if you're hooked on stories that dig deep, that twist your gut and make you question everything, hit that subscribe button. Stick with us at Tales of Twist. Stay sharp out there. Stay a Justice isn't handed over on a silver platter. It's clawed for, fought for, tooth and nail. Across town, in a sleepy little neighborhood where the houses sat close together like old friends sharing secrets, 14-year-old Lucas pedaled his bike down the sun-warmed street. The early summer heat pressed down on him, a heavy blanket of warmth that made the air shimmer above the asphalt. His messy brown hair stuck to his forehead, damp with sweat, but his curious hazel eyes sparkled with the kind of restless energy only a kid on the cusp of growing up could have. Lucas was the kind of boy everyone in the neighborhood knew not, just because he'd lived there his whole life, tucked into a modest house with his parents, but because he was always there when someone needed him. He'd dash across lawns to return a piece of mail that had fluttered away in the wind, or lug grocery bags up creaky porch steps for someone too frail to manage alone. To Lucas, it wasn't just habit, it was who he was. He liked being useful, liked the way people's faces lit up with gratitude. It made him feel like he mattered in this quiet corner of the world. That afternoon, with the sun hanging lazily in the sky, Lucas decided to take a walk. The neighborhood was still, the kind of stillness that hums with cicadas and the distant bark of a dog. The houses lined up in neat rows, each one a mirror of the next white picket fences here. A riot of garden flowers there, colorful front doors that hinted at the lives tucked inside. He loved the rhythm of it all, the way it felt safe and steady, like nothing could ever shake this little bubble he called home. As he rounded the corner, his sneakers scuffing against the cracked sidewalk, he spotted Mrs. Martha. She lived just 2 houses down from his. An elderly woman with a crown of silver hair and a smile that could warm you from the inside out. Everyone knew her not just because she'd been there longer than most could remember, but because she had a way of making you feel seen. She'd wave from her porch, her voice carrying tales of the good old days when kids played stickball in the streets, and the neighborhood thrummed with life. But today, something was off. Mrs. Martha stood on her sagging front porch, her thin frame hunched over as she wrestled with an ancient television set. Its bulky frame teetered dangerously in her trembling hands, and a frown creased her weathered face. Lucas didn't hesitate. "Mrs. Martha, you need a hand," he called out, already jogging toward her, his voice bright with concern. She looked up, relief washing over her like a cool breeze. "Oh, Lucas dear," she said, her words shaky but warm, "this old thing's been nothing but trouble. I'm trying to get it outside, but it's like it's turned to lead all of a sudden." He flashed her a grin, the kind that hid the effort he was about to put in, and crouched down to grip the TV's heavy edges. It was a beast scratched and faded, with knobs that hadn't turned in years, but Lucas hoisted it up with a grunt, balancing it carefully as he shuffled toward the corner of the porch. "Let's set it right here, Mrs. Martha. Are you tossing it?" he asked, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. She nodded, her sigh carrying the weight of more than just the moment. "Yes, it's been broken for days now. They say it's not worth fixing anymore. Sometimes I think all this newfangled technology leaves us behind, don't you?" As he lowered the TV to the ground, Lucas stole a glance around her yard. Once, it had been an explosion of color roses and marigolds spilling over the edges, tended with a love that showed in every petal. Now, weeds choked the flower beds, and the paint on her house peeled away in tired curls. Mrs. Martha was getting older, he realized, and the years were pressing down on her harder than he'd ever noticed before. She dabbed at her forehead with a trembling hand, her floral apron swaying slightly as she caught her breath. "Come inside, Lucas," she insisted, her voice soft but firm. "I've got some lemonade I was just about to whip up. You've been such a help, it's the least I can do." He hesitated, knowing his mom might be waiting for him to sweep the kitchen or fold laundry. But the exhaustion in Mrs. Martha's eyes tugged at him. "All right," he said, following her through the creaky screen door. Inside, her house was like stepping into a time capsule. The air smelled of baked goods and dried lavender, a sweet nostalgia that wrapped around him like a hug. Faded photographs lined the walls, black and white smiles from decades past. Family vacations frozen in time, a younger Mrs. Martha with her late husband, Mr. John, beaming beside her. The furniture was worn, but loved, every scratch and stain a testament to a life well lived. She shuffled to the kitchen, her steps slow but purposeful, and Lucas settled at the table, watching as she poured two glasses of lemonade from a chipped pitcher. "That TV's been with me a long time, Lucas," she said, her voice breaking the stillness as she slid a glass toward him. "I think that's why it was so hard to let it go. When you've lived as long as I have, things start to carry pieces of your memories, your stories." He took a sip, the cold tang of the drink cutting through the day's heat, and nodded. He could feel the conversation shifting, dipping into something heavier. The way it often did with her, Mrs. Martha had a knack for peeling back the surface of things, for making you think about life in ways that stuck with you. "I remember when we got that set," she went on, her eyes drifting to some far-off place he couldn't see. "It was right after John and I married. We'd sit up late, watching the news, those silly soap operas, all the old films he adored. Over the years, it just sat there, gathering dust, but I couldn't bear to part with a tunnel now." Her fingers tightened around her glass, and Lucas saw the flicker of loss in her gaze, the quiet ache of letting go. "It must have been tough, Mrs. Martha," he said softly. "Letting something go that meant so much." She smiled, faint but real. It was Lucas. "But life doesn't wait for us to be ready. It moves on, and we've got to move with it. Thank you for today. Thought you were a good boy. Your mom's lucky to have you." He crept up his cheeks, and he ducked his head, mumbling a quiet thanks as he finished his drink. They chatted a little longer about the weather, the neighborhood, the way things used to be. Then he stood, promising to stop by again soon. As he stepped outside, the golden light of late afternoon had faded, giving way to a soft dusk that draped the streets in shadow. Streetlights flickered to life, casting pools of amber glow, and Lucas felt a quiet pride swell in his chest. Helping Mrs. Martha had felt good, but something about her weariness gnawed at him, a tiny splinter of worry he couldn't shake. Back home, the kitchen was alive with the sizzle of onions in a pan and the sharp scent of garlic. His mom, Mrs. Clara, stood at the stove, her dark hair pulled back in a loose bun as she stirred dinner. Lucas grabbed an apple from the fruit bowl, the crisp snap of his bite cutting through the hum of the fan overhead. "Hey, Mom," he said, leaning against the counter. "I helped Mrs. Martha today. She was struggling with this old broken TV, trying to get it out of the house." Mrs. Clara paused, turning to look at him with a warm, approving smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "You're a good kid, Lucas. I bet she was so grateful. She's been on her own ever since Mr. John passed, and I know it's not easy for her." Her words were gentle, but there was a weight to them, a quiet sadness for the woman down the street. Lucas nodded, crunching on his apple, feeling that same splinter of worry dig a little deeper. The next day, the neighborhood's calm shattered like glass under a hammer. It was late afternoon, the kitchen clock ticking steadily toward 5, when a sharp knock rattled the front door. Lucas was sprawled at the table, sketching idly in a notebook, when his mom answered it. Two police officers stood on the porch, their uniforms crisp and their faces stern. "We need to speak with Lucas," one of them said, his voice clipped and official. Lucas's stomach dropped, a cold wave of confusion washing over him as he pushed back his chair and stood. His mom's eyes widened, her hand tightening on the doorknob. "What's this about?" she demanded, her tone sharp with a mother's instinct to protect. The officer didn't flinch. "Mrs. Martha's house was robbed last night. She says Lucas was the only one she saw around recently, and she's pointing the finger at him." The words hit Lucas like a punch to the gut. His mouth went dry, his heart hammering against his ribs as he stammered. "What? No, didn't he helped her yesterday, that's all." His voice cracked, disbelief and fear tangling together in his throat. "Mrs. Martha, sweet, kind Mrs. Martha thought he had betrayed her." The room spun slightly, the soft hum of the fan now a dull roar in his ears. His dad, who'd been in the living room flipping through a newspaper, stormed into the kitchen, his face darkening with anger. "This is ridiculous," he barked, stepping between Lucas and the officers. "He's a kid, was just helping her out. You've got no proof." The second officer raised a hand, his expression unreadable. "We're just here to ask questions, sir. But we need to sort this out." Mrs. Clara's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her voice trembling with a mix of fury and fear. "He's not a thief. He's a good boy. Everyone here knows that. You can't just come in here and accuse him like this." Lucas stood frozen, his mind racing back to the day before with lemonade, the stories, the way Mrs. Martha had smiled at him. How could she think he'd do something so awful? The officers exchanged a glance, their silence heavy, and Lucas felt a sickening dread settle in his chest. The neighborhood he'd always known, the safety he'd taken for granted, was unraveling around him. Across the street, Mrs. Martha sat in her living room, her frail hands twisting the hem of her apron as she stared out the window. The robbery had left her shaken drawers yanked open, her late husband's watch gone. The little money she kept in a tin vanished. When the police asked who'd been around, Lucas's name had slipped out, a reflex born of fear and confusion. She hadn't wanted to believe it, hadn't wanted to point at the boy who'd always been so kind. But the doubt had crept in, cold and insidious, whispering that maybe she didn't know him as well as she'd thought. Now, as she watched the police car parked outside his house, guilt gnawed at her. Had she been wrong? Had her loneliness, her vulnerability, twisted her judgment? Back in the kitchen, the argument swelled as parents' voices rising, the officer's calm insistence cutting through like a blade. Lucas sank back into his chair, his sketchbook forgotten, his hands trembling in his lap. Justice, he thought dimly, wasn't supposed to feel like this. It wasn't supposed to turn a good deed into a noose tightening around his neck. And yet, here it was, raw and jagged, exposing the fragility of trust, the cost of power misused. The system, with its strings and shadows, didn't care about the truth in that moment. It only cared about what it could prove. And as the voices clashed around him, Lucas realized something bitter and unshakable. Justice wasn't a gift, it was a battle, one he'd never expected to fight. Lucas sat across from his mother at the kitchen table, the faint crunch of an apple breaking the quiet as he took a thoughtful bite. "You know, Mom," he began, his voice tinged with a mix of curiosity and concern. "Mrs. Martha invited me over for lemonade today. She's always so kind, but I couldn't help noticing how tired she looked. Her house was a little chaotic, dishes piled up in the sink, dust clinging to the shelves. Even her garden, usually her pride and joy, was overgrown with weeds choking the flower beds. I don't think I ever saw it like that before." His mother, Mrs. Harris, stood by the stove, stirring a simmering pot of soup. The rhythmic clinking of the spoon against the metal seemed to echo her own weariness. As she let out a soft sigh, "Age creeps up on all of us, Lucas," she said, her tone gentle but heavy with realization. "Mrs. Martha's been on her own for a long time now. Maybe it's time we step in more of her to help with the little things. We could stop by once a week, just to check on her." Lucas nodded, his mind still lingering on the image of Mrs. Martha's frail figure against the backdrop of her cluttered home. "That's a great idea, Mom. I'll start going over there more often myself." That evening, as the Harris family gathered around the dinner table, the warm glow of the overhead light cast soft shadows across their faces. The clatter of forks against plates mingled with their conversation, which soon turned to Mrs. Martha and the other elderly neighbors who dotted their quiet street. Lucas's father, Mr. Harris, a man whose steady hands and calm demeanor always grounded the family, suggested they could mow lawns or run errands for those who couldn't manage anymore. To Lucas, it felt like a small but meaningful way to repay the community that had watched him grow from a stumbling toddler into the lanky 14-year-old he was now. The idea settled in his chest like a quiet promise, a spark of purpose he hadn't expected from such an ordinary day. But beneath the surface of that simple resolve, something far bigger was stirring, something he couldn't yet see. The next morning shattered the stillness of the Harris household with a sharp, insistent knocking at the front door. Lucas jolted awake, his heart pounding as he threw off the covers and stumbled into the hallway. His bare feet slapped against the cold wooden floor, his breath catching as he saw his parents already moving toward the sound, their faces etched with confusion and a flicker of dread. When Mr. Harris swung the door open, the sight of two police officers standing on the porch sent a shiver racing down Lucas's spine. Their uniforms were crisp, their expressions stern yet measured, and the taller of the two stepped forward. Mr. and Mrs. "Harris," he said, his voice firm but not harsh, "we need to speak with your son, Lucas." Lucas's stomach dropped. His wide eyes darted to his parents, searching their faces for answers they didn't have. What could he kid who spent his days biking to school and kicking a soccer ball around the neighborhood have done to bring the police to his doorstep? His mother's hand trembled slightly as she reached for his shoulder, her touch a silent plea for calm, but inside, Lucas's mind was a storm of bewilderment and fear. The hours that followed draped the house in a thick, suffocating tension. The officers had asked about his recent visits to Mrs. Martha's, their questions circling a burglary that had apparently taken place the night before. Lucas answered as best he could, his voice shaking as he insisted he'd only been there to help. But when they left, the unease didn't leave with them. It lingered in the air, heavy and oppressive, seeping into every corner of the home. Neighbors' glances, once warm and familiar, now carried a sharp edge of suspicion as Lucas passed by. He felt their eyes boring into him, stripping away the reputation he'd built as the good kid, one who always lent a hand. The weight of it pressed down on his chest, a gnawing ache that kept him awake long after the house fell silent. By morning, the sun blazed outside his window, its golden light mocking the storm cloud that had settled over his spirit. He couldn't just sit there, drowning in doubt. He had to act. If he was going to clear his name, he needed to find the truth himself, and that meant finding the real thief. As he mulled it over, his thoughts kept snagging on Mr. Roberts, the quiet man who lived a few houses down. Roberts was an enigma in the neighborhood, a figure who kept to himself, his graying hair and stooped shoulders blending into the background of their everyday lives. Lucas had spoken to him briefly the day before, asking if he'd seen anything odd the night of the robbery. Roberts had been polite, his voice low, and even as he claimed ignorance. But there'd been a flicker in his eyes, a hesitation, so brief Lucas might have missed it if he hadn't been watching so closely. It gnawed at him now, that tiny crack in the man's calm facade. Could it mean something? Lucas remembered snippets of hushed conversations between his parents, mentions of Roberts's money trouble spills piling up, a job lost months ago. Desperation could twist a person, couldn't it? Push them to cross lines they'd never imagined stepping over. The thought sent a chill through him, but it also lit a fire. He needed to know more. That afternoon, Lucas found his father in the backyard, kneeling among the tomato plants with dirt-streaked hands. Mr. Harris's broad shoulders were hunched in concentration, but he straightened when he saw Lucas approaching, his brow furrowing at the worry etched across his son's face. "Dad," Lucas started, kicking at a clump of grass to mask his nerves. "I've been thinking about Mr. Roberts. You and Mom mentioned something a while back about him having financial problems. Do you know anything more?" His father's eyes narrowed slightly, surprise flashing across his weathered features. "Why are you asking about that, Lucas?" he said, setting down his trowel. Lucas swallowed, knowing honesty was his only option. "It's about Mrs. Martha's place. I talked to Mr. Roberts, and he said he didn't see anything that night, but I don't know, Dad. Something felt off, and if he's struggling with money, maybe there's a connection." Mr. Harris's frown deepened, and he rose to his feet, brushing soil from his knees. "Lucas, I get that you're trying to make sense of this mess, but you're treading on thin ice. Accusing someone without proof isn't just risky, it's wrong. Roberts has been our neighbor for years. Sure, he's had a rough patch, lost his job 6 months back, been scraping by ever since. The bank's been on him about the house, and I've seen the strain in his face. But that doesn't make him a thief." Lucas's cheeks burned with a mix of shame and stubbornness. "I'm not saying he did it, Dad. What if he was desperate enough? We can't pretend nothing's happening." His father sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I hear you, son, and I won't leadspiration can break people. But you've got to be careful. If you're set on digging into this, don't go it alone. Come to me if you need help. I don't want you tangled up in something you can't handle." Lucas nodded, gratitude mingling with his resolve. He turned back toward the house, his mind buzzing with new determination. The truth was out there, and he'd find it no matter how deep he had to dig. The next day, Lucas woke before the sun, the sky still a bruised purple as he slipped out onto the porch. He'd decided to watch Mr. Roberts, to study the man's routine for any hint of something amiss. Roberts was a creature of habit, leaving every morning just after dawn for a walk through the neighborhood's winding streets. Lucas settled into a shadowed corner, his breath fogging in the crisp air as he waited. Right on cue, Roberts emerged, his lanky frame clad in faded athletic gear, his steps slow but deliberate. Lucas followed at a distance, his sneakers silent against the pavement as he trailed the man through quiet lanes, lined with sleepy houses. The walk was uneventful. Roberts looped around head down, lost in his own world until he returned home. But instead of heading inside, he paused on the porch, his gaze sweeping the street with a wariness that made Lucas's pulse quicken. Then, with a quick glance over his shoulder, Roberts veered toward the small tool shed tucked against the side of his house. Lucas ducked behind a gnarled oak, peering out as Roberts disappeared into the shed. Minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last, until the man emerged clutching a wooden box. The way he held it tight yet hurried, like it was both precious and dangerous, sent a jolt through Lucas. Roberts darted inside with it, the door slamming shut behind him, and Lucas was left staring, his mind racing. What was in that box? Something tied to the robbery, evidence he couldn't let slip away. He crept back home, the questions piling up like storm clouds. He needed a plan, and he couldn't do it alone. That afternoon, he called Isabel, his closest friend and the sharpest mind he knew. She arrived at his house within the hour, her dark curls bouncing as she plopped onto the couch, her eyes narrowing as Lucas spilled everything he'd seen. "That's weird," she said, her voice low with intrigue. "Why's he acting so cagey? And that box, what's he hiding in there?" Lucas leaned forward, his hands clasped tight. "That's what I'm dying to figure out. I think it might be something big, maybe even proof he's involved with what happened at Mrs. Martha's. But I can't just barge in and look." Isabel tapped her chin, her mind already spinning. "We don't have to. What if we set up a camera? Hide it somewhere with a clear shot of the shed. We could catch what he's up to without him ever knowing." Lucas's eyes lit up, though a flicker of caution tempered his excitement. "That could work, but we have to be slick about it. If he spots it, we're toast." "Where do we even get a camera?" Isabel grinned, a spark of mischief in her gaze. "Leave that to me. My brother's got an old trail cam he used for a science project. We'll figure this out together." As they sat there, plodding under the hum of the ceiling fan, Lucas felt a surge of hope and a deeper lesson taking root. Justice wasn't just about pointing fingers, it was about seeking truth, no matter how tangled the path. But he couldn't ignore the shadow lurking beneath it all: power. Even the quiet kind Mr. Roberts might wield, could corrupt when pushed too far. The consequences of that misuse were rippling through their little world, and Lucas was determined to see them through to the end. Isabel's voice carried a quiet confidence as she leaned toward Lucas, her eyes glinting with the spark of an idea. "My older brother's got this little camera he uses to record his soccer games," she said, her tone casual yet deliberate. "He's pretty attached to it, but I'm sure he wouldn't mind if I borrowed it for a day, especially if I spin it as a school project." Her words hung in the air, and Lucas felt a flicker of hope ignite within him, like a match struck in the dark. It wasn't much, but it was something, a thread to cling to in the tangle of uncertainty that had been gnawing at him. "That could actually work," he replied, his mind already racing ahead. "If we can set it up without anyone catching on, we might finally get some answers." The thought of unraveling the mystery sent a shiver of excitement through him. Though it was laced with the sharp edge of nerves, they had a plan now, fragile as it was, and it felt like the first solid step toward the truth. With their scheme taking shape, Isabel dashed off to her house, her footsteps quick and purposeful against the cracked pavement of their quiet neighborhood. Left alone, Lucas sank into his thoughts, his brow furrowing as he pictured the shed in his mind's eye. It sat at the edge of Mr. Roberts's property, weathered and unassuming, its peeling paint and sagging roof blending into the overgrown yard. He needed to figure out the perfect spot for the camera, somewhere hidden yet, with a clear view of whatever secrets the shed held. Speed would be key. He couldn't afford to linger and risk being seen. Discretion wasn't his strong suit, was more the type to stumble through life with honest clumsiness, but this time, he'd have to channel a stealth he didn't naturally possess. Determination burned in his chest, a steady flame that drowned out the whispers of doubt. He wasn't just curious anymore, he was driven, compelled to peel back the layers of suspicion that had settled over his world like dust. When Isabel returned, the small camera clutched in her hands. The afternoon stretched out before them, heavy with possibility. She handed it over with a grin, and Lucas turned it over in his palms, feeling its weight both literal and symbolic. Together, they huddled on his front porch, the late sun casting long shadows across the wooden boards as they tinkered with the device. They tested the focus, adjusted the angle, and ran through every setting to ensure it wouldn't fail them when it mattered most. Their conversation flowed in hushed, urgent tones as they mapped out their next move. "Roberts takes his walk every morning, right around dawn," Isabel mused, tapping her chin. "That's our window and he's gone, and the place is empty." Lucas nodded, picturing the man's routine, the slow shuffle of his boots, the way he'd tip his hat to neighbors as he passed. It was the perfect moment to slip in unnoticed. They decided to tuck the camera among the tangled bushes near the shed's grimy window, a spot that offered a direct line of sight inside. Every detail mattered, and they left nothing to chance, their shared resolve binding them tighter with each passing minute. The next morning arrived with a chill that seeped into their bones, the sky still bruised with the last traces of night. Lucas barely slept, his mind buzzing with restless energy, and when he met Isabel outside, he saw the same tension mirrored in her shadowed eyes. They exchanged a quick, wordless glance, half encouragement, half nervous, and waited, crouched behind a row of overgrown hedges. The moment Mr. Roberts emerged, his coat pulled tight against the dawn breeze, they sprang into action. His figure receded down the street, oblivious to the two figures darting toward his property. Isabel took her post near the corner of the house, her breath puffing out in small clouds as she scanned the surroundings, every rustle of leaves making her flinch. Lucas, meanwhile, crept toward the shed, his heart hammering so loudly he was sure it would betray him. The camera felt slick in his sweaty grip, and his hands trembled as he nestled it into the bushes, twigs snagging at his sleeves. He angled the lens with painstaking care, aiming it through the smudged glass toward the spot where he'd seen Roberts disappear. With that mysterious box the day before, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting wood, and for a fleeting second, he wondered if he was crossing a line he couldn't uncross. But there was no time for second-guessing. He darted back to Isabel, her whispered "all set," cutting through the silence. "Yeah," he managed, his voice tight with adrenaline. "It's done. Now we wait." They retreated to Lucas's house, slipping away from Roberts's property as the neighborhood stirred to Wackertain's twitching, a dog barking faintly in the distance. The hours that followed were torture, each minute stretching into an eternity. Lucas paced the living room, his sneakers scuffing the worn rug, while Isabel perched on the couch, picking at her nails. They tried to distract themselves with small talk, but their words felt hollow, overshadowed by the weight of what they might uncover. When the time finally came to retrieve the footage, Lucas's stomach twisted into knots, a cocktail of dread and anticipation churning inside him. Isabel plugged the camera into his ancient laptop, her fingers steady despite the faint tremor in her breath. The screen flickered to life, and at first, there was nothing, just the dim interior of the shed, shadows shifting lazily across the walls. Lucas's hope began to waver, his shoulders slumping, but then movement. Roberts stepped into frame, the same box cradled in his arms, its edges scuffed and worn. Lucas's pulse quickened as he leaned closer, his breath catching as Roberts set the box down and pried it open. The camera, though discreetly placed, caught glints of light bouncing off something inside decimal plastic bags, and what looked like polished metal. Isabel's voice broke the silence, a hushed gasp. "Is that jewelry?" Lucas squinted, his mind racing to make sense of the blurry shapes. The objects gleamed faintly, their curves and edges suggesting rings, necklaces, maybe earrings. Roberts moved with a deliberate caution, his hands steady but his posture tense, as if he knew the gravity of his actions. He began unloading the bags, arranging them on a rickety shelf with a care that bordered on reverence. "Could it be Mrs. Martha's?" Isabel whispered, her wide eyes reflecting the screen's glow. The name hit Lucas like a punkmer's. Martha, the sweet old widow down the street whose house had been broken into weeks ago, her prized heirloom stolen. The thought that Roberts, a man he'd known since he was a kid chasing fireflies in the summer dusk, could be behind it was a bitter pill to swallow. "I don't want to believe it," he murmured, his voice thick with disbelief. "But it's right there in front of us." The evidence stared back at them, undeniable and stark. Yet Isabel's expression shifted to one of caution. "Lucas, if this is real, we can't just rush in. We've got proof, sure, but confronting him or going to the cops could backfire if we're not smart about it." Her words grounded him, pulling him back from the edge of reckless anger. She was right. This wasn't just about justice, it was about consequences, about navigating the fallout without painting targets on their own backs. Lucas rubbed his temples, the weight of their discovery pressing down on him. "Let's wait until tonight," he suggested, his voice low but firm. "The neighborhood will be quieter, and we can face him when he's not expecting it. But we need to be ready for denial, for anger, for anything." Isabel nodded, her jaw tight, and though the air between them crackled with tension, there was a shared understanding. They were in this together, no matter how messy it got. As evening fell, the world outside softened into stillness. Streetlights buzzed faintly, casting pools of amber light onto the empty sidewalks, and the houses around them dimmed one by one. Lucas's nerves coiled tighter with each passing hour, his mind replaying the footage in a relentless loop. By 9 p.m., the neighborhood felt like a ghost town, and he met Isabel on the sidewalk outside Roberts's house, their silhouettes blending into the shadows. "You good?" she asked, her voice steady despite the faint quiver in her hands. Lucas took a deep breath, the cool night air sharp in his lungs, and nodded. "Let's get it over with." They approached the front door. The wood chipped and faded from years of neglect, and Lucas raised his fist to knock. The sound echoed in the silence, a hollow thud that seemed to reverberate through his bones. Seconds dragged by, each one an eternity, until footsteps shuffled closer from within. The door creaked open, and there stood Roberts, his face etched with exhaustion and a flicker of surprise. His gray hair was mussed, his eyes sunken, and the lines on his forehead deepened as he frowned. "Lucas, Isabel, what's going on? It's late." His voice was gruff, tinged with suspicion, and Lucas felt his throat tighten, words sticking like glue. He forced them out anyway. "Mr. Roberts, we need to talk. It's important, really important." Confusion clouded Roberts's features, but he stepped aside, gesturing them in with a weary wave. The living room welcomed them with its familiar clutter, a sagging couch, a coffee table littered with old newspapers, a faded armchair that creaked as Roberts sank into it. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and dust, and though the space once felt warm to Lucas, it now carried an oppressive weight, as if the walls themselves knew what was coming. Roberts watched them settle onto the couch, his gaze darting between them. "All right, you're scaring me. What's this about?" Lucas swallowed hard, his hands clenching into fists on his knees. He couldn't dance around it any longer. "Mr. Roberts, I know things have been rough for you. My dad mentioned the bank troubles, how you're struggling to keep the house. We wanted to help, but then I saw you with that box in the shed, and I had to know what was going on." Roberts's eyes widened, a flash of panic breaking through his tired demeanor. "Box? What are you talking about?" he stammered, but Isabel cut in, her voice steady and unyielding. "We saw you, Mr. Roberts. We set up a camera, caught you with the jewelry. If it's Mrs. Martha's." Then she let the implication hang heavy and accusing. The color drained from Roberts's face, his hands gripping the arms of his chair until his knuckles whitened. "You recorded me?" he rasped, his voice cracking. "How could you do that?" "I can explain, then do it," Lucas pressed, fighting to keep his tone even. "If you were desperate, maybe we can figure this out without the police. But you've got to tell us the truth." Roberts's shoulders slumped, and he dragged his hands down his face, a man unraveling before their eyes. When he finally spoke, his words were barely above a whisper, laced with shame. "You're right. I took it, Martha's jewelry. The bank's about to foreclose, Lucas. I was drowning, and I thought I could sell it, get back on my feet. I never meant for it to go this far. I never wanted you dragged into it." Lucas's chest tightened, a storm of emotions crashing through him, anger at the betrayal, sorrow for the man's desperation, and a reluctant pity he couldn't shake. "Why her, though?" he demanded, his voice rising. And why let everyone think it was me when the cops came sniffing around? Roberts flinched, unable to meet his gaze. I didn't plan it, he muttered. When the police showed up, I panicked. I let the rumors spin out of control. And now I'm stuck in this hole I dug myself. Isabel, who'd been watching silently, leaned forward, her expression a mix of resolve and heartache. Mr. Roberts, you have to give it back. Mrs. Martha's been through enough, and Lucas doesn't deserve to carry this blame. Roberts nodded, defeated, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. You're right. I'll return it. I'll turn myself in. Tui can't keep running from this. But please, let me talk to her first. Let me try to make it right. Lucas and Isabel exchanged a glance, weighing his plea. They saw the remorse in him, raw and real, and though it didn't erase the wrong, it offered a path forward. They agreed, stepping back into the night with a fragile hope that justice could still prevail, not through vengeance, but through accountability. As they walked away, the lesson sank deep into Lucas's bones. Power, even in desperation, came with a price, and the scales of right and wrong demanded balance, no matter how heavy the cost. The truth hovered on the horizon like a storm cloud ready to break. Yet Lucas felt its weight pressing down on him with an almost unbearable heaviness. He had peeled back the layers of deception and uncovered the real thief. But the cost of that revelation gnawed at him relentlessly. The quiet streets of his once tranquil neighborhood seemed forever altered, the air thick with the echoes of betrayal. Every familiar sight: neatly trimmed lawns, the old oak tree at the corner, the pastel-painted house in oak carried a tinge of melancholy, as if they too mourned the loss of trust that had once bound the community together. In the dim light of Mr. Roberts' cluttered living room, the night before, Lucas had stood with his heart pounding, his voice steady despite the turmoil churning inside him. If you did this out of desperation, he had said, forcing a calm he didn't entirely feel. Maybe there's a way we can sort this out without dragging the police into it. But you've got to come clean with us, Mr. Roberts. No more lies. His words hung in the air, fragile yet firm, a lifeline thrown to a man drowning in his own mistakes. Mr. Roberts sat slumped in his worn armchair, the lines on his weathered face deepening as he dragged his hands across it, as though he could scrub away the shame clinging to him. His broad shoulders, once a symbol of reliability to Lucas, now sagged under an invisible burden. Inside, a war-raged pride clashing with guilt, fear wrestling with the faint hope of redemption. For a long moment, he said nothing, his silence a deafening confession. Then, slowly, he lifted his head, his hazel eyes shimmering with tears he fought to hold back. You're right, he whispered, his voice rough and low, cracked with the weight of his admission. I did it. I took Mrs. Martha's jewelry. Lucas, I was desperate. Bank's about to foreclose on my house. I didn't know where else to turn. I thought if I sold it, I could fix everything. But I never meant to point the finger at you. I never wanted any of this to spiral so far. Lucas stood rooted to the spot, a storm of emotions swirling within him. Anger flared hot and sharp. How could someone he'd trusted stoop so low? Yet beneath it simmered a quiet sadness, a pang of pity for the man unraveling before him. Mr. Roberts wasn't a stranger. He was the neighbor who'd tossed a baseball with Lucas in the yard, who'd shared stories of his youth over lemonade on sweltering summer afternoons. Now, that same man sat broken, his desperation laid bare. Lucas understood the crushing pressure of a life teetering on the edge, but it didn't erase the sting of betrayal. Why, Mr. Roberts? He asked, his voice trembling with frustration, each word laced with the hurt he couldn't hide. Why would you do this to Mrs. Martha? She's been through enough. And why let her think it was me? Mr. Roberts' gaze dropped to the faded rug beneath his feet, unable to meet the accusation in Lucas' eyes. I didn't think, he murmured, his voice barely audible, as if speaking louder would make his guilt more real. When the police showed up, I panicked. I let the lie take root, and before I knew it, I was tangled in a mess I couldn't escape. I'm so sorry, Lucas. His words were a plea, a confession, a surrender all at once, and they left him looking smaller, diminished by the consequences of his own cowardice. Across the room, Isabel watched with keen, attentive eyes, her dark hair catching the faint glow of the lamp. She'd been Lucas' steadfast ally through this ordeal. her sharp mind piecing together clues he might have missed. But now, her heart ached too. Heavy with the sorrow of seeing a man she'd once admired reduced to this, she stepped forward, her voice gentle yet firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Mr. Roberts, you need to give the jewelry back. We have to tell Mrs. Martha the truth. She doesn't deserve to suffer like this." Wondering who betrayed her, and Lucas shouldn't have to carry the stain of a crime he didn't commit. Her words weren't just a suggestion, they were a moral anchor, pulling the room back to a sense of justice. Mr. Roberts nodded, his defeat complete, his broad hands trembling as he clasped them together. "You're right," he said, his tone resigned but resolute. "I'll return it, and I'll turn myself into the police. I can't keep running from this. But please, let me talk to Mrs. Martha first. I owe her that much." His eyes flicked between Lucas and Isabel, searching for a shred of mercy, and in that moment, they saw not a villain, but a man crushed by his own poor choices, yearning for a chance to make amends. Lucas and Isabel exchanged a glance, a silent agreement passing between them. Despite the hurt, they could sense the genuine remorse radiating from Mr. Roberts. It wasn't their place to absolve him, but they could at least grant him this small dignity. "Okay," Lucas said softly, his voice steadying as he spoke. "But you have to do it soon. She deserves to know." With that, they left his house, stepping into the cool night air, the promise of his confession lingering behind them. Yet as they walked away, Lucas couldn't shake the oppressive weight pressing against his chest. He'd found the truth, yes, but at what cost? The neighborhood he'd grown up in, with its unspoken bonds and quiet comforts, felt fractured beyond repair. The next morning dawned with a heaviness that seemed to seep into every corner of the town. The sun rose reluctantly, its golden rays muted by a veil of clouds, casting a somber shadow over the streets. Lucas stirred awake long before his alarm, his mind buzzing with restless thoughts. The confrontation with Mr. Roberts replayed in his head, like a broken record. Tears in the man's eyes, the quiver in his voice, the crushing admission of guilt. He knew the end was near, that justice was inching closer, but the anticipation twisted his stomach into knots. He threw on a faded hoodie and jeans, his movements quick and mechanical, and made his way downstairs. In the kitchen, the air was thick with unspoken tension. His mother, Mrs. Harris, sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. Her auburn hair was pulled back loosely, and her hazel eyes stared blankly out the window. Lost in thought, across from her, Mr. Harris flipped through the morning paper, but his usual focus was gone. His brow creased deeply, his fingers tightening on the pages as though he could squeeze answers from the ink. Lucas paused in the doorway, sensing the shift in the room. Something had happened, something big. "Lucas, sit down," Mr. Harris said abruptly, his voice carrying a gravity that made Lucas' heart skip. He set the newspaper aside, its headlines unread, and fixed his son with a piercing stare. Searching for the right way to begin, Lucas slid into a chair, a lump forming in his throat. He'd known this reckoning was coming, but facing it now, under his father's steady gaze, felt overwhelming. "What's going on, Dad?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. Mr. Harris leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "The police stopped by this morning," he began, his tone measured but firm. "They came about the robbery at Mrs. Martha's place. But this time, they weren't here to point fingers at you. Seems the real thief turned himself in." Relief washed over Lucas like a cool wave, loosening the tightness in his chest, but it was quickly tempered by a flicker of unease. He knew what was coming next, and he wasn't ready for his parents to unravel the full story. "Mr. Roberts went to the station at dawn," Mr. Harris continued, his voice softening slightly as he relayed the details. "He admitted he stole Mrs. Martha's jewelry, said he was desperate, that the bank was about to take his house. He handed over everything, the jewelry, even the cash he hadn't spent. The police said he couldn't live with the guilt any longer." Mrs. Harris let out a long, weary sigh, her eyes brimming with a quiet sadness. "That poor man," she murmured, almost to herself. "It doesn't excuse what he did, but I can't fathom the kind of despair that drives someone to such a terrible mistake." Lucas nodded mutely, his mind racing as he processed the news. He'd done the right thing, digging for the truth, but the victory felt hollow. Mr. Roberts wasn't some hardened criminal, was a neighbor, a friend, a man broken by circumstance. Lucas had seen the regret in his eyes, the way his hands shook as he confessed. Deep down, he knew Mr. Roberts wasn't evil, just lost. Lucas, Mr. Harris said suddenly, his gaze sharpening. Did you already know something about this? The question hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. Lucas hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of the tablecloth. He couldn't lean out to his parents. Not after everything. Yeah, Dad, he admitted, his voice low. Isabel and I found out last night. We saw him hiding the jewelry in his shed. We confronted him, and he broke down, told us everything. He said he'd turn himself in, but he wanted to talk to Mrs. Martha first. Mrs. Harris gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and pride. Oh, Lucas, that was so brave of you, she said, her voice trembling. But what if something had gone wrong? That could have been dangerous. Guilt tugged at him as he met her worried gaze. I know, Mom, he replied, his tone apologetic. I should have told you sooner, but I had to clear my name. And now Mr. Roberts is facing the consequences. He's sure we really don't think he meant to hurt anyone. Mr. Harris took a deep breath, his stern expression softening as he weighed his son's words. I get why you did it, Lucas, he said finally. You wanted to prove you were innocent, and honestly, I'm proud you stood up for yourself. But this whole mess, it's a lesson. Desperation can push good people to do bad things. What matters now is that the truth's out, and Mr. Roberts will have to answer for what he's done. Justice isn't always clean or easy, but it's necessary. What about Mrs. Martha? Lucas asked, his thoughts drifting to the elderly woman who'd been caught in the crossfire. Does she know yet? Mrs. Harris nodded, her expression somber. Yes, the police went to her house right after Mr. Roberts confessed. She was shaken up, naturally, but they gave her jewelry back and explained everything. It'll take time for her to heal from this, I reckon. Lucas' heart sank at the thought of Mrs. Martha, her kind smile, her gentle voice facing yet another blow in a life already marked by loss. He knew he had to see her, to offer whatever comfort he could. After breakfast, Lucas headed to Isabel's house, his footsteps heavy on the familiar path. She was waiting for him at the gate, her arms crossed, her expression a mix of seriousness and quiet understanding. I heard what happened, she said as he approached, her voice steady. Mr. Roberts turned himself in, didn't he? Lucas nodded, shoving his hands into his pockets. Yeah, he confessed everything. I'm glad it's over, but it's tough to wrap my head around Simeon we trusted doing something like that. Isabel fell into step beside him as they wandered down the sidewalk, the crunch of gravel underfoot punctuating the silence. I get it, she said after a moment. You don't expect people you know to fall so far, but you did what was right, Lucas. Now every one of ours, Martha, Mr. Roberts, even US can start picking up the pieces. Her words were a bomb, grounding him in the chaos of his emotions. I'm going to see Mrs. Martha, he said, glancing at her. She shouldn't be alone right now. Isabel's lips curved into a small, supportive smile. She'll appreciate that. It'll mean a lot to her, knowing you're still there. With a quiet thank you, Lucas parted ways with Isabel and made his way to Mrs. Martha's house. The short walk felt endless, each step weighted with purpose and dread. When he reached her faded blue door, he paused, his knuckles hovering over the wood. What would she say? Would she blame him for not acting sooner? Steeling himself, he knocked. The sound sharpened the stillness. After a moment, the door creaked open, and there she stood, Martha, her frail frame draped in a worn cardigan, her gray hair disheveled, her eyes, red and swollen from tears, softened when she saw him. Lucas, dear, come in, she said, her voice quivering like a leaf in the wind. He stepped inside, the house eerily quiet without the hum of her old television. They settled in the living room, the faded floral couch creaking under their weight. For a long moment, neither spoke, the silence thick with shared grief. I heard you figured it all out, Mrs. Martha said at last, her hands twisting in her lap. About Mr. Roberts, Lucas nodded, his throat tight. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Martha. I should have stopped it sooner. She reached out, her trembling hand resting on his. No, child, she said softly. You brought the truth to light. That's what matters, and it reminds us all power. Desperation can twist even the best of us, but justice, it finds a way. In that moment, Lucas understood the deeper lesson woven through the pain. The consequences of abusing trust ripple far beyond the act itself, but the pursuit of justice, however messy, holds the power to mend what's broken. The room hung heavy with silence until Martha's voice, trembling yet resolute, pierced through the stillness. "The police told me everything," she said, her words slow and deliberate, as if each one carried the weight of her unraveling world. "They said you and Isabel were the ones who helped uncover the truth, the real culprit." Her gaze settled on Lucas, a young man whose familiar presence now felt like a lifeline. "I don't even know where to begin. I'm so ashamed, utterly ashamed for ever thinking you could have been involved in something so awful." Lucas tilted his head, his eyes softening with a compassion that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep within him. He shook his head gently, the motion almost instinctive, as though dismissing her guilt before it could take root. "Mrs. Martha, please, there's no need to apologize," he said, his voice steady and warm, like a hand extended in reassurance. "I get it, you were terrified, thrown into a mess of confusion and doubt. Anyone would have struggled to make sense of it. What matters now is that the truth has clawed its way to the surface. Mr. Roberts turned himself in, and that's a step towards something right in all this chaos." Martha reached out, her fingers trembling as they closed around Lucas's hand. Her eyes, glistening with unshed tears, reflected a storm of emotions: grief, disbelief, and a fragile flicker of gratitude. "I just can't wrap my head around it," she murmured, her voice cracking under the strain. "Roberts, I mean, I've known for years, decades even. He was always there, a steady figure next door, the kind of man who'd wave from his porch with a smile. How could he do this? I suppose desperation has a way of twisting people, doesn't it? It reshapes them into something you'd never recognize, something you'd never expect." Lucas nodded, feeling the gravity of her words settle over him like a heavy coat. "I didn't see it coming either," he admitted, his tone quieter now, as if he were sifting through his own tangled thoughts. "I never imagined he'd cross that line. But I think when people are backed into a corner, when they feel like there's no way out, they lose themselves. What gives me some peace is that he owned up to it. He's ready to face the consequences, and that's more than some would do. It's a hard lesson. Justice doesn't always feel clean or satisfying, but it's there." Martha let out a long, shuddering sigh, her grip on Lucas's hand tightening for a moment before easing. "You're right," she said, her voice steadier now, though still laced with sorrow. "I just hope he finds some kind of peace behind those bars, and I hope we can all find a way to move past this wreckage. I don't know what I'd have done without you and Isabel stepping in. I was drowning, Lucas, and you threw me a rope." A faint smile tugged at Lucas's lips, not one of triumph, but of quiet encouragement. "We'll get through it, Mrs. Martha," he promised, his words carrying a sincerity that seemed to lighten the air between them. "I'm not going anywhere. Whenever you need me, I'll be here." Martha mirrored his smile, though her eyes still held a shadow of sadness, a lingering ache that time alone could mend. "Thank you, Lucas," she said softly. "You're a good soul. I'm lucky, blessed, real to have a neighbor like you." They lingered there, perched on the edge of her worn sofa, the faint hum of the world outside filtering through the open window. Their conversation stretched on, weaving through the tension that had gripped the room earlier. Slowly, the atmosphere softened, the sharp edges of their shared ordeal dulled by the simple act of talking it out. For Lucas, a flicker of hope emerged amid the debris of the day's revelations. Maybe things wouldn't snap back to how they'd been, but perhaps they could find a new rhythm, a fragile balance born from the ashes of betrayal. Later that night, Lucas sank into the cushions of his living room couch, the dim glow of a lamp casting long shadows across the space. Isabel sat beside him, her presence a quiet comfort that needed no words. They'd been through a whirlwind together, a storm that had upended their small corner of the world and left them questioning everything they thought they knew. The silence between them wasn't heavy, though it was the kind that comes from understanding, from weathering something profound side by side. Isabel shifted, her voice breaking the stillness like a pebble dropped into a still pond. "Lucas, do you think things will ever feel normal again?" Her tone was tentative, her eyes searching his face as if he might hold the answer to a question she wasn't sure she wanted solved. Lucas paused, his brow furrowing as he turned her words over in his mind. "I don't know if normal is the right word anymore," he said finally, his voice thoughtful. "Everything shifted us, the neighborhood, even how we see people. But maybe that's not the worst thing. We've learned something raw and real about trust, about how desperation can unravel someone. The truth's out now, and that's a start. We can build from there, even if it's not the same as before." Isabel's gaze drifted, her expression pensive as she absorbed his response. "You're right," she said after a beat, her voice gaining a quiet strength. "Sometimes it takes a mess like this to shake us awake, to make us see people for who they really are. It hurt, God. It hurt, but I think we're better for it." Wiser, maybe. The silence returned, but it felt different now, lighter, as though some invisible weight had lifted. Lucas glanced at her, gratitude swelling in his chest. Having Isabel by his side through this had forged their friendship into something unbreakable, a bond he knew would hold no matter what lay ahead. In the days that followed, the neighborhood began to stitch itself back together. Though the seams were still tender, Mr. Roberts, after his confession, had been taken away in handcuffs, his fate now resting in the hands of a courtroom miles from their quiet streets. His house, once a cornerstone of the block with its neatly trimmed lawn and welcoming porch, stood empty and forlorn. The sight of it gnawed at Lucas every morning as he walked to school. The faded curtains in the windows, a stark reminder of what had been lost. He couldn't shake the ache in his chest, a mix of pity and frustration. Roberts had crossed a line. Yes, but Lucas couldn't help wondering what had pushed him there. Life could be merciless, he realized, and desperation was a thief that stole reason and left wreckage in its wake. The community felt the ripple effects too. Where neighbors once exchanged easy laughter over fences, there was now a guarded quiet, a hesitation in their glances. People moved through their routines, but a shadow lingered, a collective reckoning with the fragility of trust. Mrs. Martha bore the weight of it most visibly, though she carried herself with a quiet dignity. Lucas could see the toll it had taken. The way her shoulders sagged a little more, the way her smiles didn't quite reach her eyes. He made a point to stop by often, running errands or sitting with her over tea, determined to ease her burden however he could. Slowly, her stories returned, her laughter creeping back like spring after a brutal winter. One afternoon, as they sat on her porch, the air thick with the scent of blooming jasmine, Martha fixed Lucas with a look that carried the wisdom of years. "I've been thinking a lot about all this," she said, her voice steady but rich with emotion. "And I've decided I'm literally lucky to have you round. Not everyone gets that, you know, someone they can lean on when the world turns upside down. It makes me cherish this little community even more, flaws and all." Lucas felt a lump rise in his throat, touched by the raw honesty in her words. "I think we're both lucky, Mrs. Martha," he replied, his voice soft but firm. "I'm grateful for you too. We'll navigate this together, and maybe we can help the others find their way too." As weeks bled into months, life in the neighborhood began to hum with a cautious new energy. Children's laughter echoed down the streets again, and adults traded nods and small talk, their weariness easing with time. Word of Roberts's downfall spread, a bitter tale tempered by a growing sense of renewal. For Lucas, the experience had carved something permanent into him. He wasn't the same boy who'd once waved at neighbors without a care. Now, he saw the layers beneath messy, human truths that shaped every choice. Justice, he'd learned, wasn't just about punishment. It was about facing consequences and finding a way to heal. Power, when abused, left scars, but honesty could mend them. Isabel stayed his constant, their partnership blossoming into a quiet mission. They threw themselves into community projects, block cleanups, potlucks, anything to weave the frayed threads of their neighborhood back together. Bit by bit, they rekindled the warmth everyone had taken for granted. Roberts's house found new life too. Sold to the Santos family, a lively bunch with 2 kids and a sharp-eyed grandmother named Alira. One day, as Lucas and Isabel set up chairs for a youth club they'd started, Mariana Santos approached, her smile as inviting as the breeze rustling the trees. "You're Lucas and Isabel, right?" she said, her voice bright. "I'm Mariana, and this is my mom, Alira. We just moved in and heard about what you're doing. Mind if we join?" Lucas grinned, struck by her warmth. We'd love that, he said. Alira stepped forward, her gaze sharp but kind. My husband always said a community's strength is in its young people, she offered, her words carrying the weight of experience. You two are proving him right. Lucas felt a spark of pride, a quiet resolve settling in. The scars of the past lingered, but with each new step, he and Isabel were turning pain into purpose, proving that even after betrayal, humanity could bloom anew. The late afternoon sun dipped low, casting golden streaks across the neighborhood as Lucas stood on the cracked sidewalk, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak trees lining the street, carrying with it the faint scent of blooming jasmine. He watched Mariana Santos and her mother, Mrs. Alira, chatting animatedly with a small group of neighbors near the community center. Their voices, warm and steady, floated through the air like a soothing melody, cutting through the lingering heaviness that had clung to this place for months. Lucas felt a flicker of something unfamiliar stirring in his chest up, perhaps, though it was tinged with the bittersweet ache of everything that had come before. Mariana tilted her head slightly, catching her mother's eye for a brief, knowing moment before turning back to Lucas. Her dark hair shimmered under the fading light, and her expression softened as she spoke. We heard whispers of what happened here before we arrived, she said, her voice carrying a quiet strength. It must have been unbearable for everyone losing that sense of safety, watching the threads of this community unravel. But seeing people like you working to stitch it back together, it gives me faith that this place can heal, maybe even become something stronger than it was. Her words landed gently, but they stirred a storm of emotions in Lucas. He shifted his weight, glancing down at the scuffed toes of his sneakers. The past few months had been a blur of shock and grief. Roberts, a man he'd once admired, had spiraled into a darkness no one saw coming, leaving behind a wreckage of trust and a neighborhood teetering on the edge of despair. Yet here was Mariana, her presence like a breath of fresh air, offering a perspective that made Lucas feel both seen and understood. Beside her, Mrs. Alira nodded, her weathered hands clasped together as if holding onto some unspoken wisdom. It takes a special kind of heart to pull people together after something like that, she added, her tone rich with empathy. You're doing more than just fixing what's broken. You're showing everyone that justice isn't just about punishment, it's about rebuilding. Lucas felt a warmth spread through him, a quiet pride mingling with the weight of responsibility. He'd always thought of justice as something distant courtrooms and consequence, but now, standing here, he saw it differently. Justice could be this, too, a community refusing to let one man's abuse of power define them, choosing instead to rise above it. He managed a small smile, meeting Mrs. Alira's steady gaze. We're all just trying to figure it out together, he said, his voice softer than he intended. I guess we've learned the hard way that ignoring the cracks doesn't make them go away. But maybe how we respond, how we hold each other up, that's what matters. Isabel, who'd been lingering nearby, stepped closer, her auburn curls catching the last rays of sunlight. She'd been listening intently, her sharp green eyes flickering between Lucas and the Santos women. And with new families like yours here, she chimed in, her voice bright with conviction. It feels like we've got a real shot at making this place whole again. You bring something we've been missing, a fresh start, a reminder that we don't have to stay stuck in what happened. Mariana's lips curved into a grin, her eyes sparkling with a quiet determination. Count us in for whatever you need, she said, leaning forward slightly as if to seal the promise. We're not just here to settle in, want to be part of this, to see where it all goes. Mrs. Alira chuckled softly, resting a hand on her daughter's shoulder. Oh, you'll be hard-pressed to keep us away, she teased, her laughter easing the tension in the air. That evening, the community center buzzed with more energy than Lucas had seen in months. The youth club meeting drew a crowd, kids barely out of middle school, teenagers with restless hands, even a few adults who'd wandered in out of curiosity. The room smelled of stale coffee and fresh paint, its walls still bearing the faint scars of neglect from harder days. As they brainstormed ideas, fixing up the sagging benches in the public square, planning a potluck to bring neighbors face to face, Lucas felt the spark of possibility ignite. He caught Isabel's eye across the room, her clipboard in hand, as she rallied the group with her usual fierce enthusiasm. She was a force, a whirlwind of practicality and passion, and he couldn't help but feel grateful for her steady presence. After the meeting, as the others trickled out into the twilight, Mariana and Mrs. Alira lingered behind. The four of them, Lucas, Isabel, and the Santos women, stood in a loose circle near the door, the hum of conversation fading into a comfortable silence. Mariana tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, her gaze thoughtful. "What you've got here," she said, gesturing vaguely around the room. "It's something real. It might not feel like much yet, but these small steps, they're the glue that holds a place like this together. Especially after everything, it's like you're proving that trust can grow back, even when it's been trampled." Mrs. Alira nodded, her expression serene but firm. "A crisis can break people apart, make them turn inward. But you're showing them there's another way to lean on each other, to fight for what's good. That's no small thing." Her words carried the weight of experience, and Lucas wondered what stories lay behind her calm demeanor, what losses she'd weathered, what lessons she'd carried with her to this new home. The days that followed were a whirlwind of purpose. Lucas and Isabel threw themselves into expanding the club's reach, knocking on doors and coaxing hesitant neighbors into joining their efforts. The Santos family became a cornerstone of it all. Mariana, with her infectious energy, rallying the younger kids into action, and Mrs. Alira, with her quiet strength, offering a listening ear or a plate of homemade cookies whenever morale dipped. She quickly earned a reputation as the neighborhood's unofficial sage, her porch becoming a gathering spot where people lingered to share worries or swap stories. One of their boldest projects was the revival of the little park at the edge of town. Once a haven of laughter and scraped knees, it had fallen into disrepair, its swings creaking mournfully in the wind, its benches splintered and faded, its paths choked with weeds. Lucas remembered it from his own childhood, the sticky summer days spent chasing fireflies while his parents watched from the shade. Now it stood as a silent witness to the neighborhood's struggles, a mirror to the decay that had crept in after Mr. Roberts' betrayal. "Let's bring it back," Lucas suggested one evening, his voice firm with resolve. "Not just for us, but for everyone who's felt like this place lost its soul." That Saturday, the park hummed with life. A motley crew assembled under a cloud-streaked sky, teenagers wielding paintbrushes, parents hauling bags of mulch, kids darting around with boundless energy. Isabel took charge, her clipboard a makeshift command post, as she directed traffic with a grin. Mariana and Mrs. Alira arrived with a cooler of lemonade and a tray of sandwiches, their laughter mingling with the clatter of tools. Lucas found himself kneeling beside a weathered bench, a can of bright blue paint in hand, the sharp scent of it filling his lungs. The rhythm of the brush against wood was meditative, each stroke peeling back layers of neglect. He paused mid-stroke, sensing someone nearby, and turned to see Mrs. Martha approaching. She was a weary figure, her silver hair pulled back in a loose bun, her faded denim shirt rolled up to her elbows. In her hands, she carried a bucket of paint, her steps slow but deliberate, her face, etched with lines of a life well lived, broke into a smile Lucas hadn't seen since before the chaos. "Thought you could use an extra pair of hands," she said, her voice carrying a playful lilt. "I may not be as spry as you kids, but I can still manage a brush." Lucas blinked, caught off guard by the sight of her. Mrs. Martha had been a fixture in his memories, always at the edges of neighborhood gatherings, her sharp wit a quiet comfort. But after Mr. Roberts' fall, she'd retreated, her house growing dark and silent. Now here she was, paint splattered and radiant, a flicker of her old self rekindled. "We'd love that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This park's got so many stories. I bet you've got a few of your own." She settled beside him, dipping her brush into the can. "Oh, more than a few," she replied, her eyes drifting across the park as if seeing ghosts of the past. "My husband and I used to bring our boys here, casing them around until we were all out of breath. Then the grandkids came, and it was their turn to wear us out. This place was alive back then, full of noise and joy. I'd hate to see it stay a shadow of that." As they worked, the conversation flowed, memories of sticky picnics, of firework nights when the sky blazed gold and red. Lucas felt a pang of awe at her resilience. Mrs. Martha had carried her own quiet burdens through the storm, and now she was here, painting beside him, her hands steady despite the years. The park's transformation mirrored her own, a slow, stubborn return to life. By dusk, the benches gleamed with fresh color, the grass was tamed, and the playground echoed with the shrieks of children testing the swings. The air buzzed with a shared triumph, a fragile but fierce reclaiming of what had been lost. Mrs. Alira stood with Mariana near the edge of the scene. Her arms crossed as she surveyed the reborn park. "You've breathed life back into this," she said, her voice low and reverent. "It's more than just paint and sweat, it's a promise that this neighborhood isn't done yet." Mariana's eyes shone, her hands clasped in front of her. "I'm so proud to be part of it," she added, her words trembling with sincerity. "You're showing us all what's possible." Exhaustion tugged at Lucas' limbs as the day wound down, but his heart felt lighter than it had in months. He and Isabel lingered after the others drifted home, the park glowing softly under the first stars. It wasn't just a patch of land anymore, it was a testament to what they could do when they refused to let the past choke them. Yet beneath the victory, a thread of unease lingered, the scars of Mr. Roberts' anxious abuse of trust. The havoc he'd wrought still whispered in the quiet corners of Lucas' mind. One night, restless and unable to sleep, he wandered the streets alone. The air was cool, the houses hushed, their windows glowing like lanterns against the dark. He found himself drawn to the Santos Homians, Mr. Roberts' house, now alive with new voices. Through the glass, he saw Mariana moving through the living room, her silhouette graceful as she tittied up. Her younger siblings sprawled on the rug, their laughter muffled but bright. Lucas stood there, hands in his pockets, letting the scene wash over him. It was a balm, a quiet proof that life could take root again even in broken soil. But the shadow of what had been lingered, a weight he couldn't quite shake. Footsteps crunched softly behind him, and he turned to see Isabel approaching, her coat pulled tight against the chill. She'd been at a neighbor's house, helping plan a book swap, and her face was flushed with the night's work. "Lost in thought?" she asked, tilting her head as she studied him. Her voice was gentle, but her eyes pierced through the haze of his introspection. Lucas exhaled, his breath fogging in the air. "Just taking it all in," he said, nodding toward the house. "How much has changed, how fast. We've done so much, fixed the park, got people talking again, but there's still this piece of me that feels unfinished, like I'm waiting for something to make sense." Isabel stepped beside him, her shoulder brushing his as they gazed at the warm glow spilling from the windows. She was quiet for a moment, letting the night settle around them. "I get it," she said finally. "What happened with Mr. Roberts, it's not something you just shake off. It's heavy, and it's okay to feel that. But what you've done, look as what we're doing, it's not nothing, it's everything. Even if it doesn't fix the past, it's building something better." Her words sank in, steady and sure, like an anchor in the swirl of his thoughts. Lucas frowned, his eyes tracing the outline of the house. "I keep wondering what pushed him to that point," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "He wasn't a stranger, was one of us. How does someone go from that to ruining everything? And what does it say about us? That we didn't see it coming? I feel like there's a lesson in there I haven't figured out yet." Isabel nodded, her expression softening with understanding. "Maybe the lesson isn't about him," she said, her tone measured but firm. "Maybe it's about yous, about how nobody's perfect, how even good people can break under pressure they don't know how to handle. What matters isn't that he fell, it's that we didn't let it bury us. We're picking up the pieces, learning what it means to hold power over each other and not misuse it. That's the justice in this." Lucas not just pointing fingers, but growing from it. Her clarity cut through the fog in his mind, and for the first time, the knot in his chest began to loosen. He realized she was right. Justice wasn't only about retribution. It was in the hands that painted benches, the voices that planned potlucks, the neighbors who chose to trust again. Mr. Roberts had wielded his influence like a weapon, leaving devastation in his wake. But they were proving that power could be something else, something that lifted instead of crushed. The past would always be there, a shadow stitched into the fabric of this place, but it didn't have to dictate what came next. "You're right," he said at last, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "It's not about forgetting, it's about living with it, letting it teach us. For me, for everyone." Isabel returned his smile, her eyes bright with quiet pride. Together, they stood there a little longer, the night wrapping around them like a promession they'd keep fighting to fulfill, one brush stroke, one conversation, one small victory at a time. Lucas trudged through the quiet streets, his boots crunching softly against the thin layer of frost that had settled over the neighborhood. The night air was crisp, biting at his cheeks, but there was a stillness to it that felt almost sacred. Beside him, Isabel matched his pace, her breath forming little clouds in the cold. They didn't need words, just empty silence was enough, wrapping them in a shared understanding of what they were working toward. It wasn't about erasing the past, Lucas thought, his mind drifting to the shadows that had once loomed so large over their lives. No, this was about proving they could rise above it, that they could forge something stronger, something lasting. Each step they took together felt like a quiet defiance, a refusal to let the weight of yesterday crush the promise of tomorrow. The lesson was clear to him. Justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about rebuilding, about holding power accountable and ensuring it could never again fracture what they held dear. The neighborhood stretched out before them, a patchwork of modest homes and flickering streetlights. Every corner they passed held a memory of late-night meetings in the youth club, of paint-stained hands repairing fences, of voices raised in both frustration and hope. These weren't grand gestures, Lucas knew, but they were victories all the same, small, stubborn triumphs that stitched the community back together, thread by thread. He could feel the progress in his bones, slow but unshakable, like a tide turning inch by inch. It was a reminder that power, when misused, left scars, but when wielded with care, it could heal. Weeks slipped by, and the neighborhood began to hum with life again. The air carried the sound of hammers and laughter as people worked side by side, their trust in one another blossoming anew. Lucas watched it unfold with a quiet awe, his heart swelling at the sight of neighbors exchanging smiles instead of sidelong glances. The past still lingered, he could see it in the way eyes sometimes darkened with memory, but it no longer held them captive. Their focus had shifted, like a compass needle swinging toward the future. Among them, Mrs. Martha stood out, her presence a steady anchor. Once, she'd been a shadow of herself, her shoulders bowed under the weight of betrayal. Now, she moved with purpose, her gray hair catching the sunlight as she darted between youth club projects and park cleanups. Her voice, warm and firm, offered wisdom to anyone who sought it, and Lucas found himself leaning on her strength more than he'd expected. She was living proof that even the deepest wounds could mend, that justice wasn't just a concept, but a force that could lift them all. One afternoon, Lucas found himself at the park they'd all poured their hearts into restoring. The benches gleamed with fresh paint, and the grass, once patchy and neglected, now stretched out in a vibrant green carpet. Children darted between the swings, their laughter slicing through the air, while parents lingered nearby, their conversations light and unguarded. Lucas stood still for a moment, letting the scene wash over him. It was ordinary, beautifully so, and it filled him with a pride he couldn't quite name. Then he saw Mrs. Martha approaching, her steps slow but deliberate, a faint smile playing on her lips. She settled beside him on the bench they'd painted together, its bright red surface still smelling faintly of varnish. For a while, they just sat there, watching the kids chase each other in dizzying circles. "You know, Lucas," she said at last, her voice soft but steady, "I've been turning things over in my mind lately." Her gaze drifted to the children, and her smile deepened, tinged with something bittersweet. "After everything happened, I couldn't believe it. Simeon I'd trusted for years, someone I'd called a friend, could do something so awful. It broke me. For a while, I wanted to lock myself away, let the hurt swallow me whole." She paused, her fingers tightening around the edge of the bench. "But then I started looking back, and I saw something I hadn't expected. All this pain, it brought us closer. It showed me how much we need each other." Lucas turned to her, his curiosity piqued. "How do you mean, Mrs. Martha?" he asked, his voice low, almost reverent. Her eyes met his, warm and bright with a hard-earned clarity. "This mess we went through," she said, gesturing vaguely at the world beyond the park. "It could have torn us apart. I could have let it harden me, push everyone away. But you and Isabel and all the others, you wouldn't let that happen. You kept showing up, kept fighting for what's right. You reminded me that even when everything feels lost, there's still good out there, waiting to be found. Her words hit him like a gust of wind, sharp and bracing. Lucas felt his chest tighten, a rush of emotion he hadn't braced himself for. He'd only wanted to help, to pull them all through the darkness together. But hearing it from her made it real in a way he hadn't anticipated. "I just couldn't stand by, Mrs. Martha," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "I wanted us to come out the other side together." She reached over, resting her hand on his, her touch light but grounding. "And we did," she said simply. "You, Isabel, all the young folks who've kept this place alive are the proof that we can stand up again, no matter what hits us." Lucas felt a smile tug at his lips, her faith in him settling like a warm ember in his chest. There was still so much to do. He knew that, but this momentous quiet exchange told him they were moving in the right direction. From then on, he vowed to keep leading by example, to keep building a neighborhood where support and growth weren't just ideals, but realities carved into every brick and beam. As winter crept closer, the community turned its eyes to the end of the year. The scars of their struggles hadn't faded entirely, but they'd woven themselves into a shared story of survival. Lucas and Isabel threw themselves into planning a grand celebration, a party to mark what they'd achieved. The park became their canvas once more, strings of lights looped between trees, casting a kaleidoscope of colors across the frost-kissed ground. Tables groaned under the weight of dishes brought by every family, a mosaic of flavors and traditions. On the night of the event, the air buzzed with excitement. Children wove through the crowd, their faces flushed with joy, while adults gathered in clusters, their voices rising and falling like a song. Newcomers like Mariana and Mrs. Elira mingled effortlessly, their laughter blending with the rest as if they'd always belonged. Lucas watched it all from a distance, a quiet satisfaction blooming in his chest. The park, once a hollow shell, now pulsed with life, a testament to their collective will. It was more than a party. It was a declaration that they'd faced the consequences of broken trust and emerged stronger. When the lights finally dimmed and the last echoes of laughter faded, Lucas lingered, the cold seeping through his coat. He felt a peace he hadn't known in months, maybe years. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, wasn't naive enough to think otherwise, but he was ready. He had his community, his family, his friends. Together, they could weather anything. Winter settled in fully, draping the neighborhood in a delicate shroud of snow. Christmas lights twinkled from every window, their glow bouncing off the icy streets. For Lucas, the season was a turning point, not just the close of a hard year, but the dawn of something he'd helped shape. On December 24th, the youth club rallied for one last event, a Christmas dinner in the park. The preparations consumed them. All tables stretched across the open space, decked with ornaments and piled high with food. When night fell, the lights swayed in the breeze, and the scent of roasted meat and spiced cider filled the air. Lucas moved through the crowd, his heavy coat brushing against the snow-dusted ground, checking that everything was perfect. Isabel appeared beside him, balancing a tray of cookies she'd spent hours decorating. "Think we're ready?" she asked, her eyes bright with anticipation. Lucas grinned, the warmth of her presence chasing away the chill. "More than ready. This is going to be a night no one forgets." And it was. Families poured in, their arms laden with contributions, their faces alight with gratitude. Mrs. Martha arrived with a quiet grace, her hugs fierce and heartfelt, while Mariana and her children brought a spark of new energy. As the dinner unfolded, the park rang with the clatter of plates and the hum of conversation. Lucas caught sight of Mrs. Martha later, sitting alone on a bench, her expression serene. He joined her, the cold wood biting through his jeans. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his breath visible in the air. She turned to him, her eyes glistening with something deep and unspoken. "Better than I ever thought I could," she said. "This year it's been a teacher, Lucas. It showed me that no matter how dark things get, we've got each other. That's where the strength comes from." He nodded, her words sinking into him like roots. They talked a while longer, the night wrapping around them, and Lucas felt the weight of their shared journey settle into something solid, something hopeful. Justice, he realized, wasn't just about righting wrongs, it was about what they built in the aftermath. A lesson etched into every laugh, every light, every step forward. The sight of the tria blending seamlessly into a picture of contentment. And camaraderie warmed Lucas's heart, tugging a broad, genuine smile across his face. Standing there, bathed in the soft glow of twinkling Christmas lights strung across the park, he let his gaze linger on them. These weren't just neighbors anymore. They were threads in the intricate tapestry of his life, each one weaving a unique strand of meaning into the fabric of this little community. It struck him then, with quiet clarity, how much these new bonds had come to matter. Each person here had poured something irreplaceable into this place, a splash of kindness, a dash of resilience that transformed their neighborhood into a haven that pulsed with life and purpose. As the evening unfolded, the air buzzed with anticipation, the kind that prickles the skin and quickens the breath. Lucas and Isabel had spent days planning the gift exchange, and now the moment had arrived. They'd turned it into a small ceremony, a shared ritual that invited everyone to join in the joy. The children, wild with excitement, darted forward the second they were given the go-ahead, their small hands snatching up brightly wrapped packages. Shouts of delight pierced the crisp night air as paper tore away to reveal treasures. Within simple toys, colorful books, little trinkets that sparkled in their eyes like gold. The adults, meanwhile, moved more slowly, their exchanges quieter but no less heartfelt. A whereupon scarf passed from one hand to another, a jar of homemade jam, a carefully written note. These were tokens of affection, modest yet brimming with intention. Together, they celebrated a unity that had grown stronger with each passing month, a bond forged not just in good times but through shared struggles. Then Mariana rose from her seat, her movements deliberate, her presence commanding without effort. The chatter faded as every pair of eyes turned toward her, curiosity flickering in their expressions. She stood there, framed by the glow of a nearby lantern, her dark hair catching the light as a faint smile curved her lips. Her hands trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from the weight of emotion swelling within her. "I'd like to say something," she began, her voice steady yet rich with feeling. "On behalf of my family." She paused, letting the words settle, her gaze sweeping across the faces before her. "When we moved here, it was a hard time for us, harder than I can easily explain. But from that very first day, you welcomed us with such warmth, such open hearts. I need you all to know how much that meant. You've shown us what community really isn't just a word, but a living, breathing thing." Her eyes glistened as she looked around, meeting each person's gaze. "And I especially wanted to thank Lucas and Isabel. You've been more than friends, you've been guides, leaders. You've taught us that even when life presses down hard, there's strength to be found. You've built something here, something better than what was before. This Christmas right now proves it. Together, there's nothing we can't face." A wave of applause rolled through the crowd, warm and spontaneous, filling the night with its gentle thunder. Lucas felt a flush creep up his neck, his cheeks burning under the sudden attention. He ducked his head slightly, a shy smile tugging at his lips as he murmured silent thanks to the universe for these people. This moment, beside him, Isabel nudged him with her shoulder, a playful little bump that carried years of trust. "Seat," she whispered, her voice soft but triumphant. "You made this happen." Her words sank into him, settling deep in his chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of pride and gratitude through his soul. Then Mrs. Alira stood, her silver hair catching the light like a halo, her posture straight despite the years etched into her frame. She was a fixture here, a quiet pillar of wisdom whose words always carried weight. The crowd hushed again, leaning in as she began to speak. "What I've witnessed tonight and over these past few months has restored something in me," she said, her voice clear and steady, resonating with the authority of experience. "It's made me believe again that a community, when it stands together, can weather any storm. This is the heart of Christmas, not the gifts or the lights, but this unity, hope, the courage to hold each other up. That's what I see here, and it's more precious than anything." Her eyes twinkled as she surveyed the gathering, a faint smile softening her weathered features. She wasn't just speaking, she was blessing them, passing down a truth she'd carried through decades. The night rolled on after that, alive with laughter and the clinking of mugs filled with hot cider. The parkance, a neglected patch of weeds and cracked pavement, now painstakingly restored by their collective hand, hummed with energy. It stood as a testament to their shared labor, a living symbol of what they could achieve when they refused to let hardship win. Lucas stepped away from the crowd for a moment, drawn to the edge of the park where the noise softened and the stars overhead sharpened into focus. He inhaled deeply, the cold air biting at his lungs, and let himself feel with overwhelming gratitude. The quiet marvel at being part of something so rare and real. Isabel joined him there, her boots crunching softly on the frost-kissed grass. For a while, they stood in companionable silence, watching the scene unfold before them, kids chasing each other in circles, the adults sharing stories over flickering fire pits, the lights casting a golden glow over it all. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and certain. "We did it, Lucas. Look at this, look at all these people, happy because of what we built. This is what counts." He turned to her, meeting her steady gaze, and felt a peace settle over him, deep and unshakable. "Yeah, Isabel," he said, his smile widening. "We did it. And this, it's just the start. We've seen what we can do together now. This neighborhood, this community, it's unbreakable." She nodded, reaching out to rest a hand on his arm, her touch warm and grounding. "It'll stay that way," she said, "as long as we keep looking out for each other." As the park lights began to dim and folks started drifting home, calling out goodbyes and Merry Christmases, Lucas lingered with Isabel. The year had begun in shadow, stout, struggle, the gnawing fear that they might not pull through. Yet here they were, closing it with a triumph that felt hard-won and holy. The silence of the winter night wrapped around them as the last stragglers left, leaving only the soft crunch of snow underfoot. They stayed a moment longer, savoring the stillness, then turned together toward home. The walk was quiet, their footsteps muffled by the fresh powder, but it was a satisfied quiet, the kind that comes after a long fight finally won. When they reached the corner where their paths diverged, Isabel paused, turning to face him. The streetlights painted her face in soft gold, and her eyes held a serenity that mirrored his own. "Merry Christmas, Lucas," she said, her smile warm and unguarded. "Thank you for being the friend we all needed, the leader who kept us going." His heart swelled at her words, a lump rising in his throat. "Merry Christmas, Isabel," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "And thank you for standing with me through every single step. I couldn't have done any of this without you." They shared one last smile, a silent promise hanging between them, then parted ways under the gentle fall of snow, the Christmas lights still glowing like stars brought down to earth. When Lucas stepped through his front door, the warmth of home enveloped him. His parents were waiting, their faces alight with pride. They pulled him into a tight embrace, their arms a steady anchor after a year of storms. "We're so proud of you, Lucas," his mother said, her voice trembling as tears brimmed in her eyes. "What you've done for this neighborhood, it's extraordinary. We're all better for it." His father nodded, clapping a hand on his shoulder, his quiet strength saying what words couldn't. "Thank you, Mom. Thank you, Dad," Lucas managed, his own eyes stinging. "I just tried to do what felt right, but I couldn't have made it through without you both behind me." They sat down to Christmas dinner, the table aglow with candlelight, and Lucas let his mind wander over the earth doubts that had once loomed so large, the small victories that had stacked up like stones in a wall, the people who'd become his strength. He knew more challenges lay ahead. Life didn't pause for triumph, but he was really bolstered by his family, his friends, this unshakable community. As the candles flickered, he made a silent wish that the unity they'd forged would endure, lighting their way through whatever came next. With that hope burning bright in his chest, Lucas understood something profound. Justice wasn't just about righting wrongs, it was about building something lasting, something good. And the consequences of power misused, they'd seen it, fought it, and turned it into this, a light that no darkness could snuff out. That was their legacy, and it would guide them forward, always.